The scene opened in late 8th century BCE Greece, at a river bend. The Alpheos flowed past low banks and sandy shallows near the sanctuary. Cicadas buzzed in tall reeds, while heat pressed gently on dust. Here stood Olympia, a place for games and rites on fixed days. Simple paths linked water, grove, and open ground for contests. People arrived from nearby towns after short travel along plain roads. The air held dry earth, olive leaves, and faint smoke. The ground underfoot was packed firm by many feet. Order came from clear spaces and a steady schedule. The sanctuary's heart was the Altes, a sacred grove enclosure. A low wall and marked gates set the grove apart from fields. Inside, trees gave shade over earth, swept clean by attendants. The central ash altar rose in layered gray mounds from past rites. Officials watched the area, kept fuel ready, and set tools aside. A water jar leaned near a shallow basin for quick washing. Reed baskets stood stacked for small offerings and ash removal. Footsteps stayed slow and careful within this center. Sun and shade shifted across carved stones and trampled paths. Around the Altes lay work zones and open tracks for events. A long running ground stretched beside the sacred space for sprints. The stadion, a straight running track about 190 meters, ran near a low slope. Markers fixed the line and turn, even when crowds stood close. Near the track, an open court gave room for warm-ups. Oil jars rested in racks beside cloths and small bowls. A wooden bench held flasks and strigils, curved scrapers for oil and dust. Quiet hands cleaned tools before and after practice. The whole area kept a plain and useful shape. Buildings were modest, with packed floors and cool rooms. A council house held store jars, wax tablets, and seal strings. Shelves carried small weights and cords for measuring prizes and offerings. A porch shaded readers who checked dates and lists. Further off, treasuries stood along the edge with heavy doors. These rooms kept city gifts and old records under watch. Stone lintels carried simple cuts for names or donors. The wind moved lightly along the porch and raised thin dust. Bronze fittings clicked once when a keeper shifted a bar. Travelers reached Olympia by road and by riverside tracks. Way stations marked distances with simple stones or notched posts. A shallow ford crossed a stream that met the main river. Carts rolled slowly to protect hubs and carry jars and baskets. Pack animals stood in shade near a well with a curb. Rope buckets dropped, filled, and rose with damp sounds. Set times staggered arrivals to reduce crowding at the gates. Staff greeted groups, checked loads, and guided them to camping rows. The approach felt measured and calm in the warm light. Arrival included checks, oaths, and names for the lists. In a quiet room, a clerk pressed a reed into wax. He wrote the competitor's name, city, and chosen event. Another board showed the fixed schedule across several days. Officials explained rules in short lines for each contest. The Hellenodikai, the games judges, kept rods and cords for starts. They trained to give signs, count heats, and settle disputes. Voices stayed low in the room as papers and tablets changed hands. A soft scrape came from a stylus removing a small mistake. The truce for travel, called ekacheria, a sacred piece for movement, guided the roads. Heralds walked or rode, carrying the date and place of the games. Towns along the routes heard the call and set it on notice. Merchants planned loads, and families arranged visits under this shield. Scholars suggest the truce reached many valleys by simple networks. A staff tapped stone as each herald reached a gate. Formal words fixed the safe days and the return time. The message moved with steady pace and careful repetition. Calm steps and clear speech supported the promise of passage. Water and shade shaped daily routine at the sanctuary. The rivers, Alpheos, and a smaller branch nearby set the edge. Wells inside the grounds supplied drink and washing through the day. Basins ringed with stone caught splash and overflow onto the soil. Attendants swept wet patches to keep footing safe and even. Clay cups and ladles hung on pegs beside the benches. Runners rinsed dust from skin and wiped with oiled cloths. The air near water felt slightly cooler at noon. Frog chirps and light ripples answered the constant insect hum. Training took place in sanded courts with clear boundaries. Fine sand cushioned feet and showed marks of form and start. Athletes warmed joints with slow circles and measured steps. A trainer called short sets and watched posture and timing. Oil eased skin and reduced friction from sand and cloth. The strigil pulled dust and oil into a thin ribbon. A boy carried the waste to a jar kept for sweepings. Shade cloths tied to poles shook once in a breeze. Breathing stayed even, and talk remained brief and focused. The starting line bore grooves to fix foot position. A simple bar or cord held the row before release. In earlier days, a voice or hand sign may have started heats. Later, devices improved, but the aim remained even starts. The line, called a balbus, a stone sill with grooves, kept order. Runners leaned forward, eyes set on a clear path ahead. The lane edges showed by use rather than by paint or rope. Sand rose in tiny puffs when practice began. After drills, the bar dropped, and stillness returned quickly. The ash altar demanded regular care to keep its shape. Each rite added small portions, then attendants leveled the mound. Rakes, shovels, and shallow baskets waited near a wood stack. Charcoal and olive wood burned with a mild, steady smell. Smoke rose in thin lines and drifted toward open space. Ash cooled, then joined the layered mass with firm taps. Water jars stood nearby to wet edges and reduce scatter. Hands moved in practiced rhythm with few words or signs. The altar held many years of such careful work. Markets and workbenches lined simple lanes outside the grove. Vendors sold olives, figs, bread, and wine in plain cups. Bronze workers sharpened strigils and knives on flat stones. Rope sellers measured cord by arm spreads and tied neat coils. Potter stalls offered cups and lamps for evening use. The hammer of a smith tapped lightly on a small anvil. A whetstone rasped with a soft, regular sound underwater. Shade screens snapped faintly as heat shifted over the ground. Visitors bartered with gestures and slow, simple talk. Lodging used tents, awnings, and open porticos. Sleeping mats lay on clean straw or woven reed panels. People kept oil jars, sandals, and small bags near their mats. Fires stayed outside in a common cooking area with rules. Stew pots simmered while bread warmed on flat stones. Groups ate early to avoid heat in the crowded hours. After meals, tools returned to bags, and ash went to pits. The night carried cricket song and low talk between rows. Lamps flickered in quiet arcs along the lanes. Records set memory for future gatherings and for local pride. Names of winners and cities went on to wax, wood, or stone. A clerk refreshed the list after each declared result. Later writers used such lists to count 4-year cycles. These cycles, called Olympiads, helped date events across regions. A reed case slid shut after notes dried and cooled. Wooden tablets hung under a porch until stone cutters arrived. Chisel points tapped softly as letters took clean form. Dust lines fell straight onto the board edge and floor. Ritual framed the games and kept order between events. Offerings marked openings, pauses, and the close of each day. Officials placed portions on the altar with measured steps. Fuel added in small pieces kept heat even and safe. water-washed hands and tools after each set action. The crowd remained outside lines set by cords and posts. A trumpet gave a short note to draw attention when needed. Then quiet returned, and the next step began as planned. Calm repetition kept both sacred and athletic matters aligned. Judges checked gear, sights, and times at regular intervals. Rods leaned against a wall, cords lay coiled on a peg. A slate or tablet showed when heats would begin. Staff paced the track to check surface and starting grooves. A boy carried a small broom to sweep loose stones aside. Another held a jar of oil for the starter's cord. The Hellenodikai kept to simple food and rest before duty. The morning air felt cool across bare arms and faces. Voices stayed level and brief, with no wasted movement. The crowd used natural slopes for viewing and rest. Packed earth curves made low terraces above the track. People stood or sat with sun cloths tied to poles. Older visitors chose shade near trees and stone edges. Children watched from behind lines under watchful eyes. Water carriers moved slowly with yokes and balanced jars. A shallow breeze ran across the slope and took heat away. Light dust rose and fell as feet shifted positions. The overall sound stayed mild, more rustle than shout. Near the river, attendants kept fish lines and water jars ready. Not all tasks tied to contests or rites. Wood needed gathering, cords needed mending, and trash needed pits. Steady hands fixed small breaks and returned tools to hooks. A teacher pointed to a carved base and read a short name. A group repeated it, then walked on toward the grove. The river hush joined the pattern of daily labor. The day moved forward with firm, simple steps. A thin bell note from a stall faded into the heat. The ground plan of Olympia remained practical and clear. Sacred space lay at the core, open ground around for games. Routes for entry, water, and food wrapped the outside edge. Workrooms and benches filled obvious gaps, close to what they served. Judges and clerks stayed near the council house for easy reach. Vendors held to lanes by rule, keeping clear the track paths. Runners moved where sand and marks signaled safe practice. Stone, sand, wood, and water each had a proper place. The layout taught order without many words. On a calm evening, the grove's shade grew long across soil. The river lowered its sound as wind fell along the banks. Lamps readied for night sat on ledges with new wicks. Tools rested in lines, rods, cords, bowls, and scrapers. Oilskins hung from pegs, and lids covered water jars. A last sweep smoothed sand at the edge of the track. Insects thinned, and the air cooled over hard earth. People settled into rows and low porches for sleep. The sanctuary held its quiet shapes under the warm, dusty sky. The Altes, a walled sacred grove, formed the heart of the sanctuary. A simple boundary marked the shift from common space to holy ground. Low walls, posts, and well-worn gates set clear lines for entry. Inside, trees cast shade across packed earth, swept smooth each morning. In the 8th century BCE, officials kept order with steady routines. The central feature was an ash altar built by repeated offerings. Pine resin lingered as light moved across the soil. Cicadas kept a constant song beyond the wall. Calm movement and simple tools guided each step. The wall itself used stone blocks and compacted fill-in places. Doorways stood narrow, with lintels of wood or stone across the top. Gate leaves, when present, swung on pins set in sockets. Cords and short poles restricted crowd flow on busy days. An attendant checked loads and reminded visitors about clean conduct inside. Footwear kicked off light dust before entering the grove. A water jar and basin stood near the gate for quick rinsing. The ground nearby showed many faint tracks from staff rounds. Rules stayed short and clear, posted on a small board. Trees within the Altes grew in planned clusters and open rings. Olive and pine were likely common, with low shrubs between trunks. The soil was packed firm by rakes and brooms used each day. Attendants trimmed branches that overhung pathways or workspaces. Fallen needles and leaves went to baskets and then to pits. Shade helped workers and slowed sparks from drifting on dry days. The scent of resin mixed with a faint trace of warm dust. Distant river hush added a steady, cool undertone. The grove felt ordered without being crowded or tight. At the center rose the ash altar, layered by many seasons. This feature formed from cooled ash, bone fragments, and settled charcoal. Officials added fresh ash after rites, then shaped it into a firm mound. A low curb of stone or packed clay helped keep edges stable. Tools tamped the surface to hold the slow-growing form. The altar's top stayed flat or very gently crowned for safety. Heat from recent rites faded to warmth in the upper layer. Smoke drifted in thin lines and thinned in open air. The mound recorded long use without loud marks. Fuel and offerings followed measured lists for each occasion. Wood included olive when available, with pine and other local species. Resin-rich kindling took a spark and held it with steady heat. Grain and oil accompanied the rite in set quantities. A libation, a poured liquid offering, ran from a small jug in lines. Officials used bronze bowls and clay cups to meter each portion. Knives and ladles lay on a low table beside clean cloths. A steward checked the items against a wax tablet. The process used modest tools and careful hands. After offerings, attendants let coals settle to a safe glow. A rake pulled surface ash to the sides in short, even strokes. A shovel lifted cooler layers into a shallow basket for the mound. Water touched the edge to bind the ash into a firm paste. The mixture spread in thin lifts to build the altar's contour. A flat tamper pressed the surface until it held shape well. The tools made soft sounds. Scrape, lift, pour, tap, and press. Smoke reduced to a faint thread over the center. The mound cooled and stayed stable through the day. Storage for tools stood along the grove's inner edge. Rakes hung from pegs. Shovels leaned against a low bench. Baskets nested inside one another to save floor space. Large jars held water, with lids to keep out dust. A small chest kept seal strings, reed pens, and wax tablets. Cloths dried on a cord stretched across shaded posts. A jar of resin and a pot of sand stood ready for work. Replacements for worn handles and cracked baskets waited in a corner. Each item had a proper place, labeled in simple script. Staff roles divided cleanly between oversight and task work. A priest supervised the order of steps and the correct amounts. Attendants handled fuel, tools, and the altar's shape after rites. A clerk recorded wood used, jars emptied, and repairs needed. Dawn and late afternoon brought routine checks around the grove. Festival days added helpers from nearby towns under guidance. Scholars suggest this pattern changed little across many cycles. The aim was regular action, not sudden change. Movements remained slow and practiced, without hurried speech or gesture. Rite times matched the wider schedule of the gathering. Trumpet notes carried from outside to start or pause activity. Inside the grove, the sound arrived gentle and thin among trees. Staff confirmed the signal and prepared materials in quiet order. One worker set kindling while another measured grain. Water stood at hand for both washing and safety. A third worker checked wind direction and cleared dry litter. Each task took place in a known spot to reduce confusion. The altar received attention only when all checks were complete. Safety developed from simple steps and constant attention. Water jars lined the edge nearest the wind on dry days. Sand stood in bowls to smother sparks that drifted from fuel. No loose cloth hung near the altar's working area. Pathways stayed open, with baskets placed off to the side. Long hair and wide sleeves tied back before any lighting. A hook and tongs set removed small embers from unwanted places. The floor around the altar remained free of cracks or hollows. Even footing reduced slips during carrying or tamping. Recording supported memory and supply planning across seasons. A clerk pressed capsule notes into wax and later copied to wood. Entries named date, fuel type, and number of measures used. Another line noted repairs, such as a replaced handle or new basket. Marks on the altar's curb recorded height at intervals. These marks helped keep the mound shape within limits. A tally of water jars helped plan well draws on warm days. At week's end, lists moved to a shelf in a cool room. The stack grew in quiet, practical order. Grove edges held other early features tied to worship. A small fenced area honored a local hero with simple rites. Scholars suggest a mound for Pelops stood nearby in later centuries. In the 8th century BCE, the area remained modest but active. Treasuries and large temples came in later times further around. Here, the working center stayed the ash altar within the wall. The context kept the focus on process, not on size or height. Shade, space, and method mattered more than large buildings. The grove's order supported both daily and festival needs. Smell and sound guided pace more than horns or shouts. Pine resin gave a lasting scent after fuel touched a small flame. Warm ash carried a chalky note that faded in cool air. A ladle clicked once on bronze as a measure finished pouring. Straps on baskets creaked as loads shifted from hand to ground. Wind touched leaves overhead and sent brief patterns on the soil. The river's hush reached the wall and softened the day's heat. Footsteps brushed grit, then stopped, letting quiet return to place. Between rites, attendants cared for the altar's skin and edges. They brushed loose ash from the curb and checked for small cracks. A thin film of water smoothed the top when dryness showed. Fresh ash applied in small amounts kept the mound from slumping. The aim was a stable surface that held shape through many days. The mound's height stayed within a known band for safety. A measuring rod confirmed the figure with a calm, routine check. When complete, tools returned to pegs in the same order. Nothing remained underfoot to catch a heel. Fuel preparation happened away from the altar in a shaded yard. Wood arrived in cut lengths and dried under airflow. Resin-rich pieces stacked near kindling for quick, even lighting. Workers split knots with small wedges and a short mallet. Chips and bark fell into a basket for later use. A scale weighed oil and grain in standard measures for rites. A scribe noted how much remained for the next day. The wood smell stayed strong in the yard and faded near the grove. That separation reduced smoke and clutter inside sacred space. Water supply came from wells and river draws at planned times. Buckets lifted by rope from a lined shaft near the wall. Carriers balanced yokes with twin jars to make fewer trips. Each jar had a lid and a loop to tie it during movement. The near basin let quick hand washing before and after service. A larger basin stood for tool cooling when metal touched heat. Drops tapped stone and ran into small grooves toward the ground. The stone stayed damp and cool even in bright sun. Flow marks showed the path of long practice. On festival days, sequence grew longer, but kept the same order. More offerings meant more ash and more finish work on the mound. Teams rotated tasks to prevent fatigue and keep steps precise. Spare tools stood ready, so no pause stopped the cleanup. The clerk added lines for the extra measures and hours. Food and water breaks followed the quiet pace of the schedule. The grove never filled with spare people or idle talk. Movement stayed measured among trees and across the packed earth. Late light crossed the altar before the final tamp. Evening maintenance closed the day with small, careful actions. Remaining warmth in the mound received a gentle water film. Edges got a last press to hold shape overnight. Tools were wiped, dried, and put away on their pegs. Baskets emptied ash waste into marked pits outside the wall. A brief walk checked posts, cords, and the gate latch. Lamps by the storage room burned low behind a cover. Resin scent softened as air cooled under the trees. The altares rested in plain shapes under fading light. Across years, the ash altar held memory in its layers. Each thin lift recorded a rite, a measure, and a season. Clerks' lists, tool marks, and curb lines told the same story. The 8th century BCE left few big stones here, but clear order. Officials tended the mound as a task, not a display. Fire, water, ash, and wood met in balanced amounts. The wall, the gate, the trees, and the central mound aligned. Pine resin lingered while light moved across packed earth. The sanctuary's center stayed quiet and steady within its bounds. The travel truce, called Ekicheria, a proclaimed period of safe conduct, set calm terms. It was announced before each festival, so visitors could move without fear. Officials in Elis oversaw the custom and kept the dates. In the late 8th century BCE, the rule already guided approach routes. The truce covered arrival, the festival days, and return travel. Weapons were not carried inside the sanctuary zone, and fights paused. The purpose was simple: let worship and games proceed in order. A wooden staff tapped stone as heralds set out. Heralds, called spondophoroi, official announcers of the truce, left Elis in teams. Each carried a staff and sometimes a wreath that marked the role. They visited town councils, market squares, and roadside shrines. They spoke set lines about dates, routes, and behavior. The message was short, clear, and repeated the same way. When towns agreed, the herald noted the pledge with simple marks. He also learned about local crossings and seasonal road changes. Then he moved on, pace steady, staff tip clicking on paving. Word spread in rings across the peninsula. Timing mattered, so departures began weeks in advance. The distance from Corinth to Olympia measured roughly 200 kilometers. Most walkers covered 20 to 30 kilometers in a day, like a long hike. Hills, heat, and river bends slowed some stretches. A few groups came by sea to a small harbor in Elis. From there, a road led inland along gentle slopes. Athletes preferred to arrive early for training and rest. Craftsmen, sellers, and cooks also planned for longer stays. Slow steps made sure all reached the sanctuary in time. The truce did not erase every border, but it eased them. City elders received the heralds and signaled acceptance with brief words. Travelers with the festival purpose moved under that agreement. Local guides pointed towards safe fords and reliable springs. If disputes arose on the road, elders urged settlement after the games. Later records show fines for cities that broke the truce. Those notes confirm that Elis claimed the right to judge cases. In the 8th century BCE, simple custom likely shaped practice. Order rested on shared respect and repeated habit. Roads themselves were mixed in surface and width. Many were packed earth with stones at wet points. Short causeways crossed marshy ground near rivers. Fords marked by poles allowed passage in late summer flows. Footpaths widened where carts often passed, leaving two faint ruts. Wayside shrines offered shade and a pause for water. Springheads had basins cut in stone to hold a small pool. Dust rose in low veils as sandals scuffed the track. Goat bells gave light notes on slopes above the plain. Supplies stayed practical and light for most walkers. Travelers carried water skins, dried figs, bread, and a small flask of oil. Cloaks folded into a pillow at night on hard ground. Simple tents were rare in this period. Porches and groves offered cover. A form of guest friendship, called zinnia, a host-guest duty, helped some groups. Families along the routes sometimes served bread and water. Athletes saved strength by spacing their days and avoiding midday heat. Trainers rubbed limbs with oil and dust to keep a firm grip. Rest stops kept the pace even and safe. Traffic varied by day and route. Some came alone with a walking staff and a small pack. Others moved in quiet lines with pack animals carrying goods. Carts creaked on gentle grades, their hubs rubbed with fat. Sea travelers heard rope fibers creak and sails ease near Elis. From the harbor road, the land track bent toward the Alpheos plain. Groups merged and thinned without crowding the way. People spoke little, saving air in the dry light. The road hummed with small sounds and steady movement. Heralds kept contact points along the way. These included fountains, rural sanctuaries, and crossroads marked by stones. At such places, they repeated dates for those leaving late. They reminded travelers to keep the truce terms near towns. They also noted any damage to routes after winter floods. A short tablet or waxboard held these notes in tidy lines. On return to Elis, these marks guided small repairs. The system relied on memory, route knowledge, and repeated inspection. Each piece kept the wider movement calm. At borders near Elis, watchers guided final approach. They asked origins, the purpose of travel, and expected length of stay. They pointed athletes toward training grounds and camps beside shade. Sellers learned where stalls could stand without blocking paths. Animals were tethered well away from the grove wall. Water jars stood in rows for washing dust from feet. Quiet rules posted on a board repeated simple limits and times. The same terms met each group without surprise or special favor. Calm entry reduced strain before rites and contests. Season shaped the feel of the road and the plain. Late summer dryness firmed paths and exposed smooth fords. Heat built slowly after dawn and eased at dusk. Cicadas filled the background with a constant dry buzz. Cloaks felt light in the morning and heavy in the noon sun. Springs ran low but clear under stone lips. Reed stems moved a little where side channels crossed fields. At night, air cooled and sounds carried farther along tracks. The staff's tap on stone echoed, then faded to quiet. The truce also covered messengers and temple loads. Oil jars, grain sacks, and incense moved under its shelter. Oxen walked in slow pairs with yokes polished by long use. Ropes groaned lightly when carts leaned on curves. Loads reached store courts inside the sanctuary schedule. Clerks noted arrivals by place and number on small tablets. The herald's early circuit helped estimate this flow. That planning reduced sharp peaks at the gates and wells. The path from road to storage stayed clear and even. When conflicts elsewhere continued, the truce drew a boundary around travel. Fighters kept away from roads and bridges marked for the festival. Scouts watched key crossings to prevent surprise trouble. If a breach occurred, reports went to Elis for review. The goal remained movement without fear and service at the altar. No loud speeches were needed to keep the plan. The pattern itself trained people by steady repetition. Over time, that habit lent weight to each new announcement. The staff's soft knock signaled both message and memory. Arrival at Olympia began with water, shade, and quiet checks. Travelers rinsed dust from hands and faces at the basins. They found places in camps, laid out mats, and loosened shoes. Athletes stretched slowly and measured the day's heat. Trainers walked the ground to learn slopes and distances. Sellers stacked goods and tied awnings to low posts. Heralds reported back that the outer routes were clear. Notes about springs, bridges, and late travelers went to clerks. The roadwork merged with sanctuary order as the festival neared. Approach routes crossed the Elis Plain and met near the Alpheos and Cladios. In the late 8th century BCE, tracks were simple, firm, and well known. Travelers followed ridges in dry weather and skirted low ground after rain. Waypoints marked springs, groves, and turns toward the valley floor. Dust lay light on the surface in summer heat. Wheel ruts fixed the line where carts often passed. Near Olympia, sound grew tighter. Leather straps creaked and axles clicked. The plain opened gently and the grove wall drew closer. Way stations stood at measured intervals, often beside reliable wells. A round stone curb protected each shaft from crumbling edges. Wood buckets hung from simple crossbars, lifted by rope and hand. Stone troughs let animals drink without crowding the well mouth. A caretaker kept the rope dry and the curb free of sand. Small notices, cut on boards, showed directions and basic rules. Cloaks brushed stone as visitors leaned, waited, and filled skins. Cool air rose from the shaft, and water moved with a soft sound. The stop was brief, quiet, and regular. Fords handled much of the river crossing in this period. Officials chose shallow shelves with even gravel and a slow flow. Marker poles showed the line at normal summer levels. Stepping stones edged the path where feet needed a higher hold. Carts entered last, with loads balanced and pace reduced. Drivers watched wheel depth and kept animals straight across the stream. Sandals darkened, then dried in the sun beyond the bank. Water lapped against ankles, then fell away. The crossing felt plain and calm when the river ran low. Simple bridges served where fords were less safe. Carpenters laid timber beams over short spans, resting on stout posts. Planks fixed with pegs formed a deck 1 cart wide. Rawhide lashings bound joints that needed tightening each season. Ropes kept side edges in view for those on foot. No stone arches stood here in the 8th century. These were practical frames built quickly and rebuilt as needed. Cartwheels thudded once on entry, then rolled in even strokes. A brief shade fell across the deck, then ended at the far bank. Maintenance followed a clear routine set by Elis officials. After winter floods, crews checked posts, replaced planks, and cleared driftwood. Men cut new pegs and dried lashings by small fires. Gravel ramps were reshaped where wheels had dug too deep. Ditches beside the approaches carried runoff away from the deck. Scribes recorded wood counts and days worked on small tablets. The work was steady, with simple tools and repeated steps. When finished, a herald walked the span and noted the condition. The bridge rejoined the route without delay. Road surfaces changed near the sanctuary. Workers leveled bumps, filled ruts with crushed stone and trimmed edges. Low banks, called berms, kept carts from sliding down loose soil. A side gutter guided sudden rain toward fields and away from traffic. Stones set at intervals acted like anchors for the surface. Sandals skimmed packed earth, and cartwheels left light tracks. Rope lashings on loads creaked in a slow rhythm. The last stretch felt even, open, and ordered by small features. Movement stayed smooth in the final approach. Checkpoints stood before the marked gates of Olympia. Watchers asked origins, purpose, and expected days of stay. Animals waited at a bar, while drivers showed lashings and loads. Oil jars, grain sacks, and tools moved forward after a short pause. Weapons and hunting gear stayed outside the grove wall. Officials showed the time board to late arrivals. A clerk counted groups using pebbles in a shallow bowl. The entries stayed simple: place, number, and intended quarter. The gate then opened for calm entry to the courts. Wells near the gates managed heavy use at peak hours. Stone shoulders widened the curb so 3 drawers could work together. A pulley beam reduced strain on arms during long shifts. Troughs stood in 2 lines, one for animals, one for people. Water skins leaned against shaded walls while groups waited quietly. Clay mugs clicked as they stacked and unstacked for rinsing. Spilled water ran along shallow grooves into a drain pit. A cool draft from below eased the heat at midday. The sound of lifting and pouring stayed even. Camps formed outside the wall where space allowed rest and order. Posts marked sleeping rows and narrow paths separated mats and packs. Shade came from simple awnings lashed to poles and cart frames. A wood pile stood near the cooking area for small fires. Waste pits lay downhill, covered and marked with plain signs. Sellers tied lines to frame stalls and then draped cloth. A designated animal ground kept carts and oxen away from the wells. Ropes tightened, knots seated, and canvas shifted softly. The camp felt measured and practical. Signs and markers guided the last turns to the entrances. A stone marker showed distance in stades, a track length unit about 180 meters. Another stone arrow pointed toward the baths and washing basins. The training ground lay beyond, marked by a narrow gate and low fence. A board listed inspection times in short lines. Heralds added notes about road patches and late arrivals. Packs pressed lightly on shoulders as people advanced. Leather straps ticked against buckles with each step. The inward flow stayed quiet and clear. The Cladio stream ran along the sanctuary's western side. In dry seasons, a ford with rounded stones offered a safe line. In wetter years, a short timber bridge stood in the same place. A handrail on one side gave a steady hold over the moving water. The crossing kept carts and foot traffic apart for a short stretch. Watchers helped keep the pace even on the narrow deck. On the far bank, the ground rose in a gentle slope. Gravel shifted under sandals, then gave way to firm soil. Approach from the south followed a terrace above the Alpheos. The route avoided boggy edges by a simple packed earth causeway. Willow stakes and woven brush held the fill in place. In late summer, the channel ran lower, and the bank stood clear. Drivers listened for wheel hubs as they passed tight points. Voices stayed low so notices and times could be heard. The causeway ended near a clearing used for assembling groups. There, an official led short lines toward the posts and gates. The flow continued without crowding. Arrival involved washing, ordering packs, and finding assigned areas. Basins lined one court for rinsing dust from hands and feet. Stalls for goods stood beyond, arranged by craft and place. Carts parked in rows, wheels chalked with stones. Scribes reviewed simple tokens or marks for supply deliveries. Athletes and trainers passed to open fields for stretching and drills. Sellers counted baskets and tied covers for the night. Leather, wood, and clay gave off calm, familiar scents. A steady pace held, set by boards, bells, and brief calls. By dusk, the outer routes eased as the last arrivals entered. Wells slowed, and caretakers tied lids against stray dust. Watchers logged late notes for the morning board. A soft movement of air cooled the approaches and camps. Cartwheels sat still, and ropes sagged a little after heat. The grove wall framed the quiet, with gates closed until dawn. Farther out, fords and bridges rested under even night sounds. The travel lines would wake again with first light and simple tasks. Movement would resume in the same measured order. Lodging spread across marked zones outside the sacred grove wall. In the late 8th century BCE, most visitors slept in tents or lean shelters. Open porticos, roofed walkways held by posts, stood near busy courts. Some were simple, with timber beams and packed earth floors. Later centuries added larger stone stoas, but early forms were modest. Officials kept walking lanes clear between tent rows and the porticos. Wells and cooking areas sat at set distances for safety. The camp felt arranged by lines, posts, and steady routines. Tent rows followed straight cords stretched tight between corner stakes. Ropes crossed at regular gaps to guide sleeping spots. Mats lay along each line, with bundles stacked beside them. Cloaks doubled as bedding during cool river nights. Small windbreaks of reed screens stood at tent ends. Pegs pressed deep into firm ground to hold corners. Leather ties creaked when tightened after sunset. A low insect hum settled over canvas and rope. The order was simple, repeatable, and easy to check by lamplight. Open porticos offered shade and a dry sleeping strip beside walls. Columns held the roof while air moved through the side gaps. Visitors rolled mats along the inner edge to avoid foot traffic. Oil jars and grain sacks lined the outer edge in neat ranks. A few benches stored bowls and small baskets overhead. Clay lamps hung from pegs with short wicks and plain holders. At night, their light stayed soft to protect nearby sleep. The porticos felt calm, cool, and clear to navigate. Cooking areas stood downwind from the tent lanes. Stone circles marked hearth spots for shared fires. Tripod stands held clay pots above glowing charcoal. Portable braziers warmed thinner stews when wood was scarce. Fire guards watched sparks and kept water jars nearby. Ash pits took last embers at the end of each session. In the morning, rakes leveled the circles for new use. Charcoal breathed a low red light around pot bases. Steam rose gently and drifted into open air. Common meals favored grain porridge, pulses, and small fish. Barley crushed in hand mills yielded coarse meal for quick cooking. Chickpeas and lentils simmered beside the main pot. Fresh river fish appeared early, while salted fish lasted longer. Olives, figs, and a little cheese rounded out simple plates. Most dishes used olive oil to finish and to soften texture. Bread came in flat rounds, warmed on clean stones near coals. The food was plain, filling, and steady through the days. Water service followed a set pattern near the wells. Drawers filled large clay jars, then handed smaller measures to groups. A lined trough served for rinsing cups and spoons only. Another basin handled pot washing with warm water and ash. Drains carried wastewater to small gravel pits downhill. A clerk counted jar issues with pebbles in a shallow dish. Buckets thumped softly against the curb as ropes moved up and down. Cool air rose from the shaft and eased the heat. Storage rested close to sleeping mats for easy guard and reach. Amphorae, two-handled jars, held grain, oil, or wine under clay plugs. Smaller lekythoi, narrow oil flasks, stood near lamps and wash bowls. Baskets carried bread, herbs, and dried fruit. Leather skins held extra water for early hours. Stamped marks on jar shoulders showed ownership or origin. Twisted reed ties sealed mouths to slow insects and dust. By dusk, covers went on, and jars leaned against posts. The storage line looked neat and readable in low light. Utensils stayed simple and light to carry. Clay bowls and cups served most meals and drinks. Wooden spoons and paddles handled stirring and serving. A bronze knife cut bread and trimmed greens on a flat board. Strainers separated broth from pulses when needed. People shared a long ladle at each cooking circle. After eating, water and ash paste cleaned surfaces without strong smell. Dishes dried on reed racks as air moved under the portico. Clay clicked softly as pieces touched and settled. Meal times followed the day's heat and the event schedule. A quick porridge and figs opened the morning before training or rites. Midday meals stayed light to prevent heavy stomachs and heat. Evenings brought thicker stews and bread, with olives and cheese. Water mixed with a little wine to keep taste steady. A time board near the court showed when fires must go low. After the last hour, only small braziers could remain. The camp moved with these calm, posted times. Vendors worked in a marked lane near the outer tents. Fish sellers arrived early with baskets covered by damp cloth. Grain sellers kept scales and small weights in leather rolls. Herb bundles hung from lines tied between posts. A potter offered new cups and small lids for jars. Payment used weighed metal or traded goods in this early era. A checker watched the lane and noted stall numbers on a tablet. Voices stayed low so buyers could hear weights and measures. The lane closed at a posted sign each dusk. Cleanliness rules kept the camp steady and safe. Ash went to a marked pit after each cooking session. Food scraps went to covered jars, and then to the waste trench. A washing line set distance from sleeping rows prevented spills. Latrine pits lay farther out, downhill from the wells. Sand spread over damp ground to keep paths dry. Each morning, a crew checked ropes, lids, and hearth rings. The routine took little time and kept movement smooth. The area looked ordered and ready by sunrise. Evening brought small tasks around lamps and mats. Menders tied a frayed rope or reset a loose peg. Hand mills turned slowly to prepare barley for dawn. Trainers rubbed oil into tired limbs near the portico edge. A lamp wick hissed faintly as it met fresh oil. Wind shifted the top cloth, then settled again. The insect hum thickened, but stayed even. Across the camp, short footfalls faded as fires went down. A cool draft moved from the river toward the inner wall. Night security relied on simple posts and quiet rounds. Watchers walked lanes at fixed times with small handbells. They checked for sparks, loose animals, and open jar plugs. A list on a clay tag showed who had the next round. If a rope sagged, a peg went deeper into firm soil. If a lid moved, a stone weight returned to its place. The routine used few words and took steady steps. The camp rested under a pattern that rarely changed. Before dawn, cooking zones woke first. Coals saved under ash glowed with a soft rise of heat. A tinder nest caught one breath of air and took flame. Water warmed for porridge while a helper crushed barley. Clay lids rattled when jars opened for the day. A runner carried a small pot toward the training ground. The portico floor stayed clean and cool under bare feet. Heat grew slowly, then paused at a gentle level. By mid-morning, stoas offered shade to readers and planners. A trainer laid out a short list of drills near a column. A clerk arranged small pebbles to track group turns. Oil jars lined the wall where athletes would pass later. A broom moved light dust into a neat pile by the edge. A low conversation ended as a bell marked the next block of time. Footsteps crossed from sun to shade with a soft change of sound. The portico kept its steady rhythm. When the sun fell, meals gathered people back to the camp. Fish hissed in shallow oil as porridge thickened nearby. Bread warmed on clean stones until crusts turned light gold. Cups passed along the mat line in calm order. The final pot lifted, and steam rose into evening air. Night insects hummed, and a lamp's glow shaped a small circle. The day's work paused, and the camp settled without haste. Rope lines held firm, and the porticos rested in quiet shade. The council house stood near the sanctuary edge, low and plain. Later Greeks called such a hall the bouleuterion, a council house. In the late 8th century BCE, its benches and tables were simple. Walls of mud brick met a timber roof, cut to admit soft daylight. Floors were hard earth, swept smooth each morning by attendants. A stone basin waited by the door for washing hands. Inside, a writing table held wax tablets, styluses, and a small chest. Lamps rested ready, but stayed dark during bright hours. The room carried quiet, even when footsteps crossed the threshold. Judges sat in an ordered row, facing the entry line. Sources call them Hellenodikai, game judges, charged with rules and order. They observed age, event choice, and readiness for the contests. Their seat order followed rank, but their tools stayed modest. Each judge used a wax tablet to mark the first details. A scribe sat slightly apart to keep the master list. A wooden box held seals and spare tablets for corrections. When a name was unclear, the scribe asked a trainer to confirm. The process was steady and did not hurry. An attendant guided entrance across a chalk mark on the floor. Each competitor stopped at a post before reaching the table. The system allowed calm spacing and clear hearing of answers. First came name and city, then father's name to prevent confusion. The scribe wrote in simple lines while a judge watched. If the entrant declared more than one event, order was noted. A wax tablet scratched softly as names received a line. The sound was faint but constant during the session. Beside the table, a small jar of sand kept hands dry. The program of the 8th century was still compact. The stadion foot race formed the core of early Olympic days. Other events came in later centuries, but order began here. Judges still needed clear entries to prevent crowded starts. They recorded the race group, the expected call, and the lane mark. A wooden board near the door showed the time blocks. Thin cords held the board steady against the wall. The list changed as spaces filled and corrections were needed. The board returned to the doorway after each small update. Age claims received careful attention to keep contests fair. Later periods had formal youth events, but early checks were simpler. Judges looked at build and voice, then turned to the trainer. The trainer carried notes on practice and a simple pledge of readiness. If doubt remained, a second judge stepped forward to compare entries. The goal was a safe field and a credible finish order. Decisions were recorded without debate or raised tones. Entrants moved on once the mark appeared on the tablet. The room kept its slow, even pace. Proof of origin mattered in a world of many city-states. Heralds had carried the truce dates earlier, but identity still needed order. Some entrants brought a short letter from a city official. Others arrived with known trainers who could speak for them. The scribe noted the city in full and added a sign. Small clay tags, marked with a line, sometimes served as reminders. Scholars suggest early practice used simple tags rather than heavy tokens. The tags rested in a shallow tray near the scribe's elbow. Clay clicked lightly when a new piece joined the row. A judge then recited the main rules for the contests. These rules covered start signals, course lines, and fouls at the turn. For the race, feet must begin behind the scratched start mark. Hands could not pull, block, or strike during close running. False starts carried fines or removal from that heat. The scribe kept a short list of penalties for later posting. The fines supported the sanctuary stores and repair work. Names receiving a penalty mark were copied to a second tablet. The tone stayed calm, and the words remained plain. The oath formed the center of the session's duty. Near the council house stood an altar tied to oaths at Olympia. Later sources name it under Zeus Horkios, oath, for truth and fairness. Competitors raised a hand and spoke a set promise of fair contest. Trainers affirmed their role to guide and keep order. Judges pledged to apply rules without favor, with steady measures. The oath text existed on a small board for clear recitation. A lamp's flame, if needed, steadied the view in low light. Voices were low, even, and brief. After the oath, the scribe sealed the master tablet for the day. A soft clay plug, a small lump of clay, took a stamp mark. The chest closed, and a cord passed through two pierced tabs. When entries resumed, a fresh tablet began the second session. Attendants checked the line outside and called the next group. A jar of water sat at the doorway for short pauses. A reed broom lifted dust that gathered near the threshold. Shoes brushed the step and then moved inward. The rhythm held, and the hour moved without strain. Before leaving, entrants received final notes on time and place. For runners, the assembly ground lay beside the starting trench. Grooves in the stone marked equal depth for every foot. Judges repeated the call time and pointed to the signboard. Trainers listened and adjusted meal times and rest periods. Oil jars, strigils, scrapers for oil and dust, and cloths were packed. The corridor air felt cooler than the sunlit court outside. The door beam shaded eyes before they stepped into bright heat. The hall returned to its measured tasks. The judges also reviewed their own schedule within the house. A separate tablet listed shifts, inspections, and posting rounds. One judge checked the starting marks each dawn and dusk. Another counted line stakes for the foot race and recorded wear. A third visited the penalty board and updated the copy. The scribe compared lists at midday to catch small gaps. A water bowl sat near the work table, covered by linen. A seal ring rested on a cord for quick chest closures. Simple tools kept the records readable and safe. Notices traveled outward by trained heralds once the lists were firm. The herald staffs bore short marks for identification and right-of-way. They stopped at the camp lanes and at the cooking circles. They read times at a steady pace, using the same words. After each stop, the wooden staff tapped the ground once. The sound was light and easy to hear in open air. Those nearby repeated the time to the next row. In this way, messages crossed the camp without rush. The camp adjusted meals, rub-downs, and rest accordingly. During quieter hours, the council house stored the day's materials. Tablets lay flat in the chest, separated by thin wooden slips. Sealed bundles waited for posting after the evening wash. Attendants swept the floor toward the threshold and carried dust outside. The basin by the door caught a last rinse from a jug. The scribe trimmed a lamp wick and closed the shutterboard. In the hush, a stylus lay across the smooth tablet face. Names and cities would return with the morning light. The stone steps cooled as the river breeze returned. If disputes rose, they were handled in the same room. The process stayed short and low in tone to preserve calm. A judge listened, read the entry line, and checked the signboard. If a correction was needed, a new line replaced the old one. The old line received a cross mark to show its end. The master list kept only the newest, clean entry. No argument lasted long. The ritual and rules shaped the outcome. The clay tag, if issued, was exchanged for a new piece. Clay clicked once more and fell still. Training proof came up in a standard question set. Later sources mention a 10-month preparation rule for athletes. Scholars suggest early Olympia still checked regular practice and diet. Judges asked about drills, rest, and readiness under heat. Trainers answered with short phrases and account of recent sessions. The scribe wrote a small sign to show "cleared for start." It was no boast, only a record of basic compliance. The hall moved to the next name without pause. Outside, the sun shifted along the portico line. Penalty notices were posted beside the entry board when needed. The tablet showed name, city, and the short rule phrase. Most entries carried no marks and went to start times. When marks appeared, trainers planned adjustments or withdrew quietly. Fines were paid at a side table during a posted hour. A small set of weights lay ready beside a bronze scale. The scale's beams settled slowly, then rested in balance for a moment. The clerk noted the weight and closed the small bag. The room stayed plain and balanced. As evening neared, the oath altar received a final visit. Judges stood for a short moment and repeated a closing line. The sun dropped behind the trees, and the air cooled. A bird called once from the grove, then fell quiet. The council house door closed on the last tablet for the day. Outside, campfires lit and lifted thin threads of smoke. Trainers spoke softly as they reviewed the next morning's calls. The river hush returned to the edge of the sanctuary. The line posts waited for another dawn of names. The gymnasium, a training court for exercise, stood near the sanctuary edge. Its plan was simple, with sand floors and a belt of shade. A low wall marked the boundary and blocked stray wind. Colonnades framed one side for shelter during bright hours. Water jars stood near basins for washing hands and feet. Wooden racks held oil flasks and cloths within easy reach. A small storeroom guarded tools behind a pinned door. The ground was raked smooth each morning by attendants. Dust settled again as footsteps returned through the day. Sand formed the working surface for warm-up, drills, and short sprints. Attendants sprinkled water when dust rose too quickly in dry heat. Lines scratched with a stick kept equal lanes for repeated starts. A cord held a signboard listing time blocks and groups. Trainers watched the board and guided their teams into place. Clay cups covered lamp wicks for later dusk light if needed. A stack of spare cloths lay beside the basins for wiping oil. A basket held strigils, scrapers of metal for oil and dust. Eriboloi, small oil flasks, hung from cords on pegs. Supervision stayed steady and calm across all sessions. Trainers counted repetitions and paced rests with hand signs. Judges walked the perimeter and checked rule sheets against drills. Early Olympia emphasized disciplined movement over show and noise. The oath from registration still shaped the acts inside the rail. Pushing, tripping, and rough claims met quick correction and short notes. The focus remained joint care, clean starts, and consistent form. Talking stayed low so signals carried clearly across the sand. The day moved evenly from group to group without hurry. Warm-up began with oil applied to skin and joints. Olive oil protected against dust and lowered skin friction during contact. An attendant poured a thin line into a small palm dish. Trainers spread it across shoulders, knees, and ankles with slow strokes. Gentle circles opened wrists and elbows before longer motions began. Legs rose and held, then lowered with measured breath counts. Backs bent forward to a fixed angle and returned. Every warm-up followed the same order so bodies recognized the sequence. Olive oil scent mixed with fine dust and quiet footsteps. Running practice occupied a clear lane set from post to post. The start zone carried grooves like the later Balbis, stone start. Feet set behind the line, with weight balanced through toes. Trainers counted down and lifted a hand for a clean release. Short sprints came first, with long rests for full recovery. Mid-length runs followed with a turn at a marked stake. Athletes touched the stake lightly and returned to the line. A water jar stood midway for brief rinses between efforts. Shadows moved slowly across the lane as drills repeated. Strength and balance training used simple, portable tools. Light stones served for holds during stepping patterns along the rail. Twisted cords functioned as tension bands for shoulder control. A wooden beam near the wall supported steady hanging and knee lifting. Trainers insisted on slow motions with full returns to start positions. Two attendants checked the sand for holes after every set. When divots appeared, they raked and patted the surface flat again. The area remained safe for bare feet and repeated landings. The rhythm of work and maintenance stayed constant. A separate corner provided space for grappling drills. Sand was drier there, offering grip without harsh scraping. Pairs practiced stance, balance, and turns under strict limits. Holds focused on placement rather than force or sudden drops. Judges carried thin rods to signal stops with a light touch. On a stop, partners stepped apart, shook sand free, and reset. Trainers corrected angles with short phrases and hand points. After each round, an attendant sifted the top sand layer. The floor returned to a clean, even bed for the next pair. Jump practice helped legs and hips prepare the start stride. A sand pit held deeper, softer fill, and a straight run-up. Ropes marked distance points measured from the takeoff line. Some athletes used halteres, hand weights of stone or bronze, for control. The weight swung forward, then back, then forward again with the jump. Feet met the sand, and bodies tilted into a gentle roll. A wooden rod smoothed the landing marks between attempts. Trainers recorded distances on small wax tablets. Counts rose gradually, then held steady to avoid strain. Between sets, rubbing and scraping restored the skin surface. Oil and dust mixed into a thin paste across arms and chest. Athletes picked up a strigil and drew it along the skin. The edge lifted oil and grit into a small curled ribbon. A cloth caught the ribbon and wiped the tool clean. Fresh oil spread again in a light film for the next drill. Basins took rinse water poured from jars with careful hands. The rinse fell with a soft splash and settled without waste. Drains led through clay pipes toward a shallow channel outside. Foot care formed a small but constant routine at the bench. Sand gathered between toes and under the ball of the foot. Attendants soaked a strip of linen, then pressed and wiped. Trainers checked callus thickness and trimmed where edges lifted. A tiny knife, kept dull, leveled uneven areas with care. Powdered chalk dried skin before new oil was applied. Spare thongs for sandals lay coiled in a small basket. A simple list tract replaced parts and used cloths. The bench area smelled of oil, leather, and clean linen. Tools received quiet maintenance at midday and evening. Strigils were checked for nicks and rubbed with a stone. Cords from a riboloi were retied when they began to fray. Pegs on the wall were counted, and missing tools were logged. Clay cups for lamps were wiped free of soot and dust. The signboard was cleaned with a damp cloth and re-waxed lines. Trainers sharpened sticks used for drawing marks in sand. A small chest held spare wax tablets and styluses. The room rested ready for the next block of drills. Food and drink breaks followed a posted schedule outside the rail. Grain bread, olives, and fish formed most midday meals. Water came from nearby wells and from stored jars in shade. Trainers kept meals light to protect the afternoon practice. After eating, athletes walked the perimeter once to wake muscles. Oil was reapplied to joints before returning to the sand. A brief rest under the colonnade cooled skin and breath. Voices stayed low, and movement resumed on the minute. The line to the start lane formed again without noise. Visitors watched from outside markers placed near the wall. The markers set a calm distance from the working lanes. Families, traders, and travelers saw the routine without blocking paths. Heralds passed on schedule updates while crossing the courtyard. When a group changed lanes, attendants waved simple hand signs. The gymnasium remained a place for order, not display. Footfalls, soft instructions, and sand rakes shaped the sound. Pine shade and warm air created a steady layer of quiet. The sanctuary's rhythm held around the practice ground. Late in the day, the air cooled and shadows lengthened. Lamps were uncovered when light fell behind the colonnade posts. A final round of scraping and washing removed the day's dust. Oil flasks returned to pegs, and cloths went to a woven hamper. Rakes crossed the floor in long, even strokes from wall to wall. Basins were emptied and wiped with the last dry cloths. The signboard received the morning's first names and times. Trainers checked the board, nodded, and walked toward camp. The court grew silent as the river hush returned. The start lay at one end of the stadion, the running track. A hard block formed the front edge of the lane area. This block is called the balbus, a stone sill with foot grooves. Sand filled the space behind it and spread down the course. Low banks framed the track and kept the surface in place. Attendants raked the sand level before each race group. Officials checked the edge for chips or loose grit. Every small point helped runners leave together and cleanly. Warm air held dust near the ground. The balbus fixed feet, so pushes matched from the first step. Grooves ran along the stone to guide toe and heel placement. Spacing fit an average stride used across Greek tracks. A wooden rule confirmed the gap between grooves before contests. If a chip shifted a groove, a small wedge filled the spot. A damp cloth cleaned grit, so toes would not slip. White chalk marked a thin line along the front edge. The line gave runners a clear boundary for their feet. It also helped officials watch for early movement. Some sillstones had 2 rows of grooves for balance. The front row caught the toes, and the back row held heels. Other sills used 1 row set for the toes alone. Scholars suggest layouts varied over the early centuries. At Olympia, cut grooves likely guided a crouched lean. The lean kept weight forward without wobble. Runners learned this stance in the gymnasium drills. The stance reduced wasted motion at release. Sand pressed firm under the back foot as toes set. The judges at Olympia were the Hellenodikai, the contest officials. They stood near the start and at the finish as well. Their tablets listed entries, heats, and lane positions. One judge watched each group for equal set positions. Another judge faced down the lanes to see the first strides. A staff in hand gave light taps for attention only. A herald, the karoo, an announcer, managed the signals. He kept the track quiet and repeated the order of races. His voice carried across the low banks and shade. Early races used a simple vocal cue to begin fairly. The herald drew breath and spoke a short command. The sound was brief and clear, without strain or drama. Sand shifted under toes at that instant, then released. Officials watched for any early jump before the voice. If movement came too soon, hands lifted to stop the group. Runners returned to the grooves and reset their feet. Attendants smoothed the sand with quick strokes. The start returned to stillness for a second attempt. Some starts also used a stretched cord as a visual cue. The cord ran across the front of the line at mid-shin. 2 attendants held it in light tension and watched the herald. When the command came, they dropped the cord downward. It fell flat into the sand with a soft sound. The cord prevented the body from tilting forward too soon. It also gave the side lanes the same signal as the center. Scholars treat this cord as an early form of start aid. Later machines came much after these first records. The start crew kept tools simple and close at hand. A basket held cords, chalk, and a short measuring rule. A thin brush swept grit out of the grooves before each heat. A clay jar held water for dampening the surface when needed. A small wedge and mallet sat nearby for quick stone repairs. Wax tablets carried the lane list in order of groups. A cloth hung on a peg for hands between tasks. These quiet objects supported fair release more than anything else. They also kept the area calm and ready. Runners used the grooves the same way each time. The front foot set into the forward slots with toes flexed. The back foot pressed into sand just behind the sillstone. Hands rose slightly, held near the trunk for balance. Eyes followed the lane ridge and the far stake. Shoulders stayed low and square to the course line. Breaths came in slow counts to steady the chest. Oil on the joints reduced chafing, but stayed in thin films. Dust clung lightly to ankles and fell back with each shake. False starts were handled with firm but quiet routine. If one runner moved early, the judges lifted staffs at once. The herald spoke a short stop word, known to all. Feet came out of the grooves, and everyone stepped back. Attendants patted the sand and re-wiped the sillstone. The group took a brief count to settle breath again. The offender might shift to the end of the heat order. Records of detailed penalties appear later in surviving texts. In this early period, fairness and calm correction mattered most. The finish end often held another stone edge. Some tracks used a second balbes to mark a clear goal. Others used a stretched cord or packed line in sand. Officials at the finish watched chest level and footfalls. The first chest across the line set the result. A small staff pointed to the lane of the winner. Voice notes captured the place order on wax tablets. A water jar waited beyond the line for quick rinses. The crowd's murmur stayed low as order returned. For double distances, runners turned at a post, the campter turning stake. The start still began at the balbus with the same stance. After the turn, feet and arms steadied for the return. The grooves at the far end, if present, were seldom used. Most runners crossed the same sill to finish the second length. Officials checked the turn area for clear paths between heats. Stake ropes kept watchers off the packed corner sand. Rakes and rods repaired divots left by sharp pivots. The surface stayed even for the next group. Maintenance of the sill took place morning and evening. Small chips were recorded on a tablet with short notes. If wear deepened, workers reset the block with fresh sand bedding. A thin slurry filled hairline cracks and dried in shade. The grooves were rubbed with a smoothing stone to remove grit. Chalk lines were refreshed after the last heat each day. Cords were hung to dry on pegs under the colonnade. The basket inventory was counted and entered on a line. Night insects hummed as the track grew still. On race day, sounds gathered, but stayed gentle and steady. Sand shifted under toes as groups took their places. The herald's short command carried over the quiet crowd. Bodies released forward in clean, measured strides. Dust rose, then fell along the lanes in soft veils. Staff taps and low notes guided the order between heats. The sun moved across the banks, then touched the grove edge. Attendants raked, lifted cords, and re-wiped the stone with care. The start remained simple, fair, and calm throughout the day. The Stadion race was the center of the first recorded festival. It used the Stadion length, a course of about 190 meters. The The track ran straight on packed sand between low earth banks. A start sill set the feet, and a line or post marked the end. Warm sun touched the course by late morning. Light wind lifted thin dust from the surface. Officials kept the field even and the sides clear. Simple order guided each step from start to finish here. The track team prepared the surface before any heat began. Attendants raked the sand level and brushed away pebbles. A water jar stood ready for light dampening if dust rose. The start sill was wiped and its foot grooves checked for grit. A thin chalk line marked the edge for clear alignment. At the far end, a cord or packed line set the finish. Stakes kept watchers off the track edges. The course looked plain, quiet, and ready for a fair sprint. Runners reached the field after short warm-ups in the gymnasium. They walked the distance once to fix the space in mind. Heats and lane places were listed on wax tablets. Judges, the Hellenodikai, held staff tips low for silence. A herald reviewed names and the order of attempts. He repeated the short rules in an even voice. The truce still covered the grounds, so calm held firm. The crowd settled to a murmur as preparations finished. Warming followed steady patterns used across Greek sites. Skin was rubbed with olive oil in a thin coat. Fine dust was then applied to reduce any slip. A strigil, a curved scraper, cleared old dust and oil. Joints received light motion until they felt loose and easy. Feet pressed into clean sand to test the push. Breathing slowed to account for rhythm control. Nothing hurried the steps. Each small move aimed at simple readiness for a straight run. At the line, runners set their toes in the grooves. Heels rested just behind the sill on firm sand. The body leaned forward with the trunk quiet and straight. Arms hung relaxed, then rose slightly for balance. Eyes followed the course edge and the finish point. The herald lifted one hand to gather stillness. His brief command sounded clear across the ground. Sand shifted under toes as bodies moved in measured release. The start looked simple, even, and fair. The first strides were short and quick, then lengthened steadily. Arms swung low and close to the ribs, without sway. Feet met the sand under the body, not far ahead. Breaths followed a set pattern learned in training rooms. The pace reached its height early, then held as long as possible. Runners aimed for straight form and smooth steps, not strain. The sun warmed shoulders and backs along the open lanes. Light footfalls and soft dust marked the rhythm. Officials watched closely from the side and from the end. One judge kept eyes on the start for early motion. Another watched the middle stretch for interference. At the finish, 2 officials stood near the line. They judged first across by chest, not by footfall. A staff tip pointed to the leading lane at once. The herald spoke the result in steady tone. A clerk scored the name on a wax tablet, then closed the cover. Records stayed brief and clear. Surface care mattered through the day. Footprints at the start were patted flat after each heat. Rakes passed over rough spots along the course. If sunlight dried the sand too much, a few drops settled it. If a gust cut across the track, heats paused for a moment. Attendants guarded the finish line so the mark stayed sharp. The track stayed plain and smooth under these simple routines. The same steps repeated for each group without change. In 776 BCE, the stadion was the only listed event. Later lists recorded the victor's name from that year. The record style kept just one winner, not the order behind. This method reinforced focus on first place at Olympia. The written year then marked the first Olympiad cycle. Time could be counted in sets of 4 years from that mark. The place, the track, and the brief note joined to set a standard. Quiet writing fixed a lasting point on a small tablet line. Crowds stayed orderly under long-standing sanctuary rules. People watched from low banks and from shaded porticos. Water jars waited at the edges for dry throats. Children sat beside elders in calm groups. Traders kept to outer rows and did not press the field. The truce meant travel, and watching could pass without trouble. Low voices made a soft, steady murmur over the grounds. Cicadas continued their buzz above the banks. The air held a dry, warm scent of dust and resin. When a heat ended, the Finnish crew guided the flow. Runners walked past the line to a waiting water jar. Small ladles lifted water for rinsing dust and oil. A cloth dried faces and hands in slow strokes. The herald repeated the name of the winner once again. The clerk pressed the stylus gently to set the letter lines. The track team returned to the sill to prepare the next group. Calm returned between these short, regular actions. The prize at Olympia was simple, even in later centuries. Tradition held that winners received an olive crown from a sacred tree. Early on, the honor lay also in the recorded name. City men and travelers heard that name spoken on the grounds. The tablet note and the spoken line joined the moment. No heavy prizes or coins marked the sprint here. The quiet form and the fair release mattered most. The result lived in clear words and steady memory. Technique teaching continued beyond any one heat. Trainers spoke earlier in the gymnasium about clean lines. They drilled posture, arm path, and foot placement without force. Runners learned to avoid sudden side moves in crowded starts. They practiced holds on speed with controlled breathing counts. They trained recovery walks and quiet exits from the course. These same patterns appeared at Olympia in measured form. The sprint became a test of order as much as of pace. The day's schedule placed the stadion early among rites. Officials balanced contests with offerings at the central altar. A small ramble of people crossed between track and grove. Pine resin lingered near the sacred space inside the wall. Here, ash from many offerings had built a raised mound. Priests kept that mound neat and shaped across the years. The sprint's time did not disturb that routine. Quiet movement linked the field and the grove throughout the day. As sun angles changed, shadows stretched across the track edge. Attendants checked that shade did not hide the finish line. If needed, they renewed the chalk or reset the cord. Wind carried short voices out toward the riverbed. The Alpheus moved with its steady hush beyond the trees. Dust rose and fell, light as flour, then settled once more. The banks held footprints of watchers coming and going. The course kept its clear shape under careful hands. After the last heat, tools returned to baskets and pegs. Cords hung to dry, and rakes leaned under the stoa. The sill took one final wipe with a damp cloth. The clerk smoothed the wax surface and tied the tablet closed. Judges placed staffs flat on a bench for the night. The herald's voice fell quiet as the grounds grew still. The sprint left a clean field and a brief written line. Warm air slowly cooled, and the murmur faded to rest. Ceremonial speech formed the bridge between effort and memory. In late 8th century Olympia, officials used a standard order after contests. Judges confirmed the result, clerks prepared the record, and the herald spoke. The aim was simple and firm. Name the winner, the city, and the event. The words traveled across the track and into the grove. They also settled into a short line on a tablet. Air felt warm and dry on the open ground. A steady routine kept each step clear. A herald, or kerix, a ceremonial announcer, served as the voice of the festival. He trained to project with even breath and steady pace. He stood near the judge's bench, but a little forward for reach. Sand underfoot gave good grip for held posture. His role did not include dispute or comment. He delivered fixed facts set by the officials. A staff in his hand marked his office and drew the eye. Around him, attendants held the crowd, edge calm with ropes. Beside the herald rested a salpinx, a bronze trumpet. It was a long, straight tube with a small bell at the end. The instrument gave a brief note that carried well in open air. The sound signaled attention without strain or alarm. Bronze warmed in the sun, but the mouthpiece stayed cool in shade. The trumpeter lifted it once, held it level, and sounded a short call. The note was clear, high, and quickly finished. It faded into the hum of the crowd. Before any words, the judges, the Hellenodikai, completed their checks. One judge watched the start for early motion. Another watched the middle of the course for hindrance. At the finish, a judge marked first across by chest at the line. Staff tips met lightly as a sign of agreement. A scribe stood nearby with wax tablets and stylus. He waited for the head judge's nod. Only then did the herald move to his place at the front. The clerk wrote the essentials while the herald prepared. The stylus scratched gently over the dark wax surface. The line included the winner's name, the city, and the event. Sometimes a father's name was added for clarity. The letters were simple and tight to save space. When the short line was set, the clerk lifted the tablet to check. He blew lightly to cool the faint wax shine. The cover string lay ready for tying when the work finished. The spoken form stayed almost the same each time. The herald named the victor in full, then named the city. He added the event, such as stadion, and when needed, the age class. His voice was even and free from rush. Names were pronounced with care, for the record and the ear. The crowd listened for the clear city name, then settled again. Dust hung in the light, then dropped to the sand. The staff point lowered to show that the line had ended. Voicecraft mattered on this open site. The herald stood tall with shoulders loose and jaw soft. He drew breath from low in the ribs for quiet strength. Words came on a straight line without breaks. He aimed above heads so sound traveled over the banks. Porticos and low walls gave a mild echo, but not much. Cicadas threaded their steady song behind the words. The trumpet's brief call prepared the field, but voice carried the meaning. Crowd order relied on simple tools and signs. A rope line marked the edge of the course. Attendants watched the front ranks and kept movement slow. Water jars sat under shade for those standing long. Vendors waited beyond the stoa and held their place. Children clustered near elders on the ground banks. When the trumpet note sounded, the murmur fell low. After the short speech, voices rose again to an even level. Sandaled feet shifted, then came to rest. The announcement space changed with each event location. At the track, the herald stood near the finish post. At the wrestling ground, he used the east side of the square. At the long jump pit, he faced the marks in the dust. Near the central altar, he kept a respectful distance. The ash mound rose quiet and steady inside the walled grove. Pine resin lingered on warm air from past offerings. The herald's routine did not disturb the caretakers at their work. A day's schedule created several cycles of sound and record. Early contests saw softer air and shorter shadows. Midday brought heat and a brighter glare across sand. Late light softened the banks and eased the voice. The salpinx note remained the same at each hour. Between contests, the trumpet rested on a hook under shade. Cloth wiped its surface to clear dust. The mouthpiece was rinsed with water and dried with linen. Tools kept clean worked well and lasted. Sometimes a winner's city sent an envoy to hear the words. The envoy stood near the line and listened for the final form. Later, he might share it in the camp rose or the stoa. The simple facts moved quickly through the grounds. Wax tablets gained a second copy when time allowed. A clerk compared the lines with care to prevent error. A cord tied the covers shut and a mark pressed the string. The tablets then returned to a chest beside the bench. Memory traveled beyond the festival through other records. Local lists at Olympia grew year by year. In later centuries, stone or bronze carried select names. Poets and notaries heard the herald, then wrote in longer form. Yet the core remained short: winner, city, event. The first recorded victor of 776 BCE became a fixed point in later lists. That tradition gave future years a way to count by sets of 4. The herald's moment was the seed for that line of time. Heralds served more than announcements of victory. They began contests with a simple call to readiness. They opened processions with one breath on the salpinx. They read oaths when required in council spaces. They called penalties with restrained words and no display. They also guided groups toward the altar at set hours. Their tasks touched athletics, ritual, and orderly movement. The same voice and trumpet knit these activities together across the grounds. Training for heralds followed quiet, practical steps. A senior carex taught placement of feet, stance, and breath. He drilled clear consonants and long, straight vowels. He timed sentences to match the wind and the distance. He practiced lifting the staff and lowering it with the final word. He taught how to turn the head slowly so lines reached each bank. He showed when to hold silence for a count before the note. Over time, these habits became easy, steady motions. Materials supported the work with simple care. Wax tablets were smoothed at day's end with gentle heat. Stylus tips were sharpened on a small stone kept in a pouch. The trumpet was polished with a soft cloth to prevent green stain. Linen covers protected the bell and the mouthpiece overnight. The staff's wood received a light oil to guard against cracks. All items returned to a chest with a fitted lid. The lid closed with a low wooden click in the evening shade. Announcement and prize were linked in order, not in place. The name came at the field soon after the judges agreed. The crown came later at a set hour near the sacred grove. Tradition placed the olive wreath from a specific tree. The act was brief and calm, with no excess noise. The herald repeated the name there in the same voice. The trumpet did not sound over the altar space. It remained quiet, resting by the wall under linen. Weather-shaped delivery, but not form. On hot days, the herald drank small sips of water. On dry days, he spoke a little slower to guard the throat. On breezy days, he waited for a lighter gust to pass. Dust swirled at knee level, then drifted down again. The short note from the salpinx still marked the moment. Listeners learned to pause as the bell tone faded. The words followed while the air was clear. The routine stayed dependable in all seasons. Small errors had simple remedies. If a name sounded unclear, the herald repeated it once. If wind stole a word, he set the line again from the start. If the clerk's tablet smudged, the stylus recut the letter. If the trumpet note faltered, the player reset his breath. No scold or show marked these repairs. They were part of the work and passed quickly. Calm hands, clear tools, and fixed steps kept results clean. Around the voice, the sanctuary's sounds continued at a soft level. The Alpheos River moved with a low, steady hush beyond the trees. Insects hummed in the heat along the bank edges. Sandals brushed the ground by the rope line in slow shifts. From the smithy row, a distant hammer gave a measured tap. Pine at the grove's edge gave a light, resin smell. Over all, the trumpet's brief note rose and fell like a marker of time, then quieted. By late afternoon, the clerk's chest held several tablets. The stylus lay flat beside a folded cloth. The trumpet hung clean and dry on its hook. The staff returned to a notch near the judge's bench. The herald's tasks resumed when the next result came. Until then, the ground settled back to calm movement. Low talk drifted between stoa pillars, and water jars cooled in shade. The ceremony waited, simple and ready, for the next clear line of words. The prize at Olympia was a simple crown made from olive. In the late 8th century BCE, this crown stood for honor without money. The custom linked victory to a sacred tree within the Altes, the walled sacred grove at Olympia. Officials kept the practice steady from one festival to the next. The crown showed who had won and how the city honored effort. Leaves carried a faint, clean scent in the warm air. When hands lifted a branch, small shadows crossed the packed ground. Calm order guided each step to the final moment. The sacred tree grew near the center of the sanctuary. It was a wild olive, valued for hard wood and steady leaves. Caretakers watched its shape and guarded the ground around the roots. They cleared weeds, set small stones to guide water, and checked for damage. A low fence marked the area so visitors did not step too close. The altar rose nearby like a mound made from many offerings. Resin and ash gave the air a dry, gentle smell. Sunlight filtered through branches and made a light mottled pattern. The grove stayed quiet except for cicadas and soft sandals. The crown itself was called a kotinos, an olive wreath for victors. The form was plain, a ring of flexible twigs set with small leaves. It weighed almost nothing, yet it carried public meaning. The crown's parts came from a tree cut at the right time. Officials watched the state of the leaves and waited for firm growth. They avoided dry months that made twigs brittle. They avoided very wet days that stained the leaves. The goal was a green, even color. All choices in the steps pointed toward that clean, simple circle. Cutting followed a fixed method. A caretaker held a small, thin knife with a straight edge. He touched the blade to a smooth twig and tested its flex. Leaves rustled lightly while the thin knife clicked against wood. A second worker steadied the branch and caught it as it fell. A clean clay pot of water waited close by. The cut pieces lay there a short time to keep fresh. A basket lined with damp cloth received them in order. The caretakers moved slowly, keeping hands low and channels clear. The ground stayed neat, with only a few green specks. Weaving used simple tools and steady fingers. A long twig was bent into a circle and overlapped at the ends. A short tie secured the join with a hidden twist. Leaves faced outward in a uniform way to present a smooth line. Each new sprig tucked under the last, like a careful seam. The worker turned the ring slowly and checked for gaps. If a leaf broke, he replaced the piece with a fresh one. He kept the circle flat on a board so it would not warp. In the background, cicadas droned at a soft, even level. Storage before the ceremony was brief and careful. Completed wreaths rested on a smooth tray under shade. A cloth, lightly dampened, lay over them to guard moisture. Air moved across the grove, warm but not harsh. A clay jar of clean water stood by for touch-ups. If a leaf curled, the worker pressed it back and checked the line. A scribe noted how many wreaths stood ready. In the earliest festival, one crown may have been enough. Later gatherings used more as events increased. In every case, the storage spot stayed cool, quiet, and watched. Presentation followed a measured order near the altar mound. Judges, or Hellenodikai, festival judges, stood with the officials in a clear space. The herald stepped aside, since his task had already ended. A path opened across the packed earth, marked by low ropes. The crown bearer held the tray with both hands and moved at a steady pace. He stopped near the judges and lifted the top wreath. Resin scent drifted from the grove's edge. A faint breeze touched the leaves and then stilled. Voices dropped to a low murmur and held there. Later writers describe an added detail that may be early. They say a boy with living parents cut the branches with a special blade. The blade was said to be gold, used only for the sacred tree. Scholars suggest this detail reflects a wish for purity in the source. If such a rule already existed, it would have guided selection and cutting. The boy's role, if present, stayed simple and silent. He would stand clear of the altar and hand the sprigs to a caretaker. In any case, the core steps remained: cut, weave, store, and crown. The moment of crowning was short and calm. A judge held the wreath at eye level, checked the circle, and turned it once. He placed it gently on the victor's head, keeping the leaves smooth. The wreath sat lightly, cool from shade and water. Olive oil on the skin made a faint, clean smell rise. The herald repeated the name in an even tone. No coins changed hands, and no goods were given. Honor alone was marked in this place. The trumpet stayed quiet near the wall. Only the leaves moved with a small, crisp sound. The meaning of a leaf crown was clear in the 8th century BCE. It joined victory to the sacred grove and to the host city's care. The prize cost little to make, yet it weighed much in recognition. Records noted the name and event for memory. Some cities, in later practice, offered meals in the Prytanion, a city dining hall, or other honors at home. Those customs varied across places and times. The common point remained the same. The Olympia prize itself was a simple wreath. The crown linked sacred ground, steady rules, and clean effort. Care for the sacred tree continued between festivals. Workers trimmed dead wood after the heat had passed. They cleared shallow channels to lead water toward the roots. In late winter, they checked for insect damage on the underside of leaves. They avoided heavy pruning that might weaken future growth. A low stone border kept carts from bumping the trunk. Boundary markers showed the protected zone. The caretakers logged each task on short tablets by season. Even when no crowds gathered, the grove held its routine. Other Greek festivals used different crowns, but the pattern stayed similar. At other games, pine or laurel served as the sign of victory. Olympia kept olive for its meaning within the grove. The tools were much the same: a knife, a basket, cloth, and water. The movements were similar: cut, bend, tie, and present. The sounds were familiar: leaf rustle, knife click, and light footfall. Across places, crowns shaped from plants showed recognition by a simple ring. Olympia's version remained the model in many minds. By evening, workers returned the tools to their chest. The knife lay on a folded cloth with its edge guarded. The basket, still damp, dried slowly under a portico. The board used for shaping leaned against a smooth wall. A clerk tied the day's notes and put them into a clay jar. Near the grove, the ash altar cooled to a low, dark color. Pine resin scent faded as the air grew softer. Leaves on the sacred tree caught the last light. The grounds settled into an easy hum, calm and even. In homes far from Olympia, Some victors kept their wreaths for years. The leaves dried, turned pale, and rustled when touched. They hung above doorways or rested in small boxes. When moved, they made a light, brittle sound against wood. Family members might point to the circle and repeat the event. The simple ring stood for a day at the grove and a name spoken aloud. No weight of metal marked that moment. It was a pattern of twigs and leaves, kept with care. The system depended on many quiet roles. Caretakers guided the tree, weavers shaped the ring, officials timed each step, scribes kept counts, and attendants held space clear. None of the jobs called for speed or display. Each one asked for clean tools, patient hands, and steady awareness. The result looked small from a distance, yet it held clear meaning up close. Olive leaves lay flat and smooth, catching a narrow band of light. The circle felt cool in the hand and rested easily on hair and skin. Across the festival days, the crown signaled a link between place and practice. The tree belonged to the grove. The grove belonged to the sanctuary. The sanctuary held the record and the right. The wreath gathered these layers into one small object. It did not last forever, but it carried memory long enough to reach home. There, lists and stories kept the name alive. Back at Olympia, the next cycle began with the same quiet tools. Leaves rustled again. The thin knife clicked against wood. The circle returned. The altar at Olympia stood as a high ash mound. It grew from many offerings placed over long years. In the 8th century BCE, officials cared for its shape and surface. They leveled ash after each rite and kept paths clear. Low borders guided feet away from the mound's edge. The air near the altar held a dry, warm scent. Pines around the altares added a faint resin note. Shadows from the trees crossed the packed earth in slow bands. Smoke drifted slowly. Embers settled with a dry crackle. Ritual order began with people and tools in known places. A priest, or hiereus, a ritual official in charge of offerings, stood near the lower step. Assistants held water, grain, and fuel within reach. A record keeper waited with a wax tablet for brief notes. Fire tenders watched the coals and lifted tongs when needed. A basket for clean wood sat under a portico, out of direct sun. Rope lines marked a clear space around the mound. Visitors stood back, and conversation dropped to a murmur. Sunlight warmed the upper ash while the base stayed cool. Before the main act, hands and vessels were washed. A basin stood on a low stand beside a water jar. An assistant poured slowly as the priest's hands turned. Drops fell on the packed earth and sank without sound. A small bowl held barley groats for a sprinkling gesture. The grains clicked softly against the ash when they landed. A jug for wine, called a libation vessel, a bowl or jug for liquid offering, waited nearby. The record keeper traced a line on the tablet for the date. The grove grew quiet except for cicadas and light footfalls. The tools were simple and well cared for. A straight knife lay on folded linen. A shallow tray held small cakes and salt. A thymiaterion, a stand for incense, stood to one side with a stock of resin. Bundles of kindling rested in order by length. Longer branches for steady heat leaned against the wall. Tongs, a rake, and a flat shovel waited near the base. A clay pot of water stood ready in case hot ash needed control. Everything had a place. Nothing sharp pointed toward the crowd. Fuel amounts followed local rule and careful habit. Pine kindling started the fire quickly. Olive wood made an even, lasting heat. Fire tenders measured the pieces by hand and eye. They set an open pattern on the mound to let air through. Coals from an earlier rite remained at the center. The tenders coaxed them with a thin stick until they glowed. When new wood caught, the smoke rose in a slow column. Resin gave a clean smell as it burned. The flame stayed low and steady without sparks. An animal might be led forward in calm steps. Officials inspected it for sound limbs and smooth coat. A ribbon or small wreath sometimes marked its role. The priest cut a small lock of hair from the head. This first tuft burned at the edge, as a simple sign. Wine drops fell on the ground in the altar face. Barley groats scattered in a light arc across the ash. The animal stood with a handler and moved little. The priest checked the knife edge on leather and lifted his hand. Loud sound did not belong in this place. Clean cuts produced ritual portions for the fire. The rule at Olympia guided which parts were burned. Bones and select fat went to the upper bed of coals. Other parts were set aside in trays for later use. The priest lifted the portions with both hands. He placed them where the heat held steady and smoke rose straight. Resin cakes crackled and released a warm scent. The tongs moved coals to make the bed even. Nothing rushed. Each step matched the earlier steps in speed and care. While the main portions burned, side offerings continued. Honey cakes, called pelanoi, simple cakes for offerings, rested on a flat board. Small bowls of barley and salt stood beside them. A measured libation poured from the jug into a shallow bowl. The liquid fell in a thin line and spread on the ash. The priest dipped a finger to steady the flow. An assistant lifted the incense stand and set fresh resin on its cup. A smooth thread of smoke rose beside the main column. Nearby leaves did not stir. The grove stayed still. The ash mound needed steady tending during heat. Fire tenders raked edges level so embers would not fall. They added wood in small amounts to hold an even glow. The shovel slid under ash and moved it back toward the center. The sound was dry and faint against the mound. When a pocket cooled, they coaxed it with a thin stick. If ash piled too high, they tapped it down in place. The priest watched the color of the coals and the drift of smoke. The work felt methodical, like slow breathing. After the burning, the remaining portions were shared by rule. Trays went from the altar area to a sheltered court. Bread, herbs, and oil stood ready on side tables. Carvers used short knives and kept pieces even. Bowls rested on low stands to avoid soil and dust. People ate in calm lines with soft speech and slow steps. A steady breeze moved across the portico. It carried a light mix of resin, bread, and warm grain. The altar area, meanwhile, cooled from bright to dark red. Smoke thinned and then faded. When eating ended, tools were cleaned and counted. Knives were wiped on linen and rubbed with oil. The incense cup cooled on a stone sill. Tongs and shovel leaned against the wall for a moment. The record keeper added a final line on the wax tablet. He noted the date, the type of offering, and the amount of fuel. The tablet would later be copied to a small wooden board. The board would dry in shade before storage. The basin was emptied, and fresh water replaced the old. The ground was swept with short, even strokes. Care for the mound followed at once. Fire tenders spread a thin layer of clean ash across the top. They checked the slope so rain would run off evenly. Small stones marked the base where people should not step. The incense stand returned to its place under shelter. Leftover fuel was stacked by length for later rites. The rope lines were tightened. The space looked quiet and orderly again. The resin scent remained in the warm air. Smoke drifted slowly, embers settled with a dry crackle. Over seasons, the mound remembered many cycles. Ash layers recorded earlier offerings in pale bands. Officials could read the surface by color and texture. New ash looked light and smooth. Older layers looked gray and compact. The priest walked the base and touched the slope with his palm. He checked for soft spots and places that needed more support. In wet months, he built low channels to lead water away. In dry months, he watched for wind scouring and added fresh ash. The mound stayed stable through careful, quiet work. Travelers saw the rite as part of the festival's frame. The crown honored the victor in public daylight. The altar confirmed the link to the sacred grove. No coins appeared at the mound, and no loud display. Meaning stood in careful order, measured fuel, and clean placement. The tools were simple, and the steps were steady. Notes kept the sequence clear for the next round. When the sun lowered, the altar face cooled. Pine resin lingered while light moved across packed earth. The grove held its calm routine for another day. In late 8th century Greece, record-keeping tied the games to time. Early lists named the victor, the event, and the city. These names fixed one cycle among many local calendars. The cycle was the Olympiad, a 4-year period between Olympic festivals. Writers from Elis treated each festival as a clear time point. Later writers used the cycles like steady pegs on a line. A stylus pressed into wax while a reed case slid shut. The method was simple, repeatable, and quiet. The writing tools were small and familiar. A wax tablet, a wooden board filled with wax for writing, sat on the table. A stylus with a pointed end made letters in the wax. Its flat end smoothed any error. For longer copies, scribes used papyrus, sheets made from a Nile plant, and a cut reed pen. The ink jar stood near a clean cloth for wiping the nib. A cord-tied rolled sheets when they dried. The tools made soft sounds in the shaded air. Nothing broke the calm rhythm of work. The record space was orderly and cool. At Olympia, lists gathered in the council house, or bouleuterion, the meeting hall for festival business. Benches lined the walls, with low writing stands in the middle. Shelves held wax tablets and tied rolls by year. A small lamp burned oil in a steady pool of light. Judges from Elis, called Hellenodikai, festival judges from Elis, checked the entries. The room opened toward a court, where carts and feet passed quietly. The air smelled of oil, resin, and sun-warmed wood. The entry format stayed the same to avoid confusion. Each line moved from event to name, then to the city. If only one event ran that year, one line was enough. When more events appeared, the lines stacked in a set order. The hand stayed neat, with letters cut at even depth. An assistant read the draft aloud for double checks. The stylus made soft, regular scratches in the wax. When the reading ended, the scribe smoothed a tiny slip and fixed the date. Wax held the first draft, but longer memory needed other media. A neat copy went on papyrus for travel. Another went to stone if funds allowed. A mason prepared a smooth face, snapped a chalk line, and set his marks. He cut shallow letters that would last in wind and rain. Chips fell in a slow, steady rain onto the ground. The stone stood near a portico or path where visitors walked past. People could find the latest names in light shade. The Olympiad count gave a shared system across many cities. Local months varied from place to place. Some towns followed different New Year days. The cycle solved this mismatch with a simple unit. Writers could say, first year of the nth Olympiad, and be understood widely. For later readers, 776 BCE marked the first named festival. From then, Each 4-year step set a steady beat. Tables matched the steps to rough modern years once, then returned to the cycle alone. The method kept reports clear and compact. Heralds and messengers carried the dates outward. When the festival ended, copies traveled to allied towns. A clerk folded a papyrus sheet, tied it with cord, and sealed it. The seal impressed a small emblem on the clay. The packet slipped into a leather bag with other notices. Footsteps tapped along porticos as the courier left. City record keepers added the lines to their own boards. The cycle spread, one quiet copy at a time. Compilers and Elis organized older notes into longer lists. Over time, they gathered runs of years that reached backward. Separate slips were checked against public stones and local memories. When lines matched, they joined into one clean table. If lines clashed, compilers marked doubt and looked again. Scholars suggest an early local catalog formed in this way. Later writers in the classical age used it for broad histories. The room work stayed the same. Wax first, fair copy next, then careful filing. Scribes followed set checks to avoid error. The tallies of events and lines had to match. Names were compared with the oath register from enrollment. If a letter form looked unclear, the scribe rewrote the entire line. The flat end of the stylus erased, then leveled the wax. The reed pen was trimmed if the stroke grew ragged. The ink was tested on an offcut before touching the papyrus. Each action was small and precise. The sound remained a light scratch and a faint slide. Storage depended on dryness, shade, and simple order. Wax tablets lay in wooden cases with leather straps. Papyrus rolls rested on shelves with clay tags. The tag gave the cycle and the list number. A mat hung at the doorway to keep dust low. In damp weather, a brazier warmed the air to guard the records. A clerk opened shutters in the afternoon to change the room's air. The place stayed plain, clean, and easy to search. Nothing distracted from the quiet work. Outside Olympia, the cycle shaped how people wrote history. City annals sometimes named a local official for each year. Travelers needed a wider key to match these lines. The Olympiad table solved this with one short note. Writers could convert a local story into the larger frame. They kept the story local, but fixed the time to the shared cycle. Later copyists added marginal marks to guide the eye. A reed case slid shut after each copy. The table remained stable across many hands. The record also guarded fairness in memory. A victor's name did not depend on rumor alone. The entry proved the city, the event, and the time. If a claim arose later, officials could show the line. If a mistake surfaced, they could mark a correction in the margin. At the next festival, a new copy replaced the flawed line. The archive stayed current without loud dispute. The method relied on small tools, short checks, and a fixed cycle. Calm steps preserved the past. Not every copy lasted, and that shaped later gaps. Fire, damp, or simple wear erased some lines. Stone broke and weathered in open air. Yet the repeated copying helped many entries endure. Each 4 years gave a new chance to affirm the list. The cycle itself, rather than one object, carried the memory onward. Soft routines made the frame strong. A stylus pressed into wax while a reed case slid shut. The work moved from hand to hand without haste. The archivist's day ended with a short routine. The lamp wick was trimmed to leave a clean edge. The last tablet stack returned to its buckled case. The ink jar was capped with a smooth turn. The floor was swept in short strokes toward the door. A clay tag received one final mark for the cycle number. From the court outside, sandals brushed the stone in even steps. Inside, the air cooled as shadows lengthened. The lists waited, simple and quiet, for the next festival year. Temporary stalls stood in neat rows beyond the sacred wall. Light linen awnings stretched over wooden poles and rope ties. Pegs bit the earth and held each corner firm. The layout left clear lanes for carts and walking. Vendors faced the paths so lines could form evenly. Oil jars, fruit baskets, and tool trays sat within reach. The air stayed warm and dry, with light breeze from the river. Quiet talk mixed with the soft buzz of insects. The scene remained calm, with no sharp noise or rush. The stalls were simple to raise and easy to fold away. Poles were cut from local pine and trimmed smooth. Cross pieces lashed with hemp cord made a light frame. A canvas or linen sheet threw shade across the bench. If the sun shifted, the cloth slid a little and was tied again. Stakes drove in with short, dull taps. A maker's mark on one pole showed the owner's set. The bench top, made from planks, did not warp in heat. Under the bench, baskets waited in dust-free shade. Food sellers offered the most common goods for travelers. There were bowls of figs, piles of flat loaves, and jars of olives. Most liquid sat in amphorae, two-handled clay storage jars. A ladle dipped oil into small bottles for athletes. Grain porridge thickened in wide pots and took sweet syrup. A few stalls cut fish into simple portions and set them on leaves. Wooden scoops measured salt or herbs by volume. Prices were stated by portion, jar, or bundle. The method was plain and fast for people in moving lines. Drink stalls kept water and mixed wine cool. Large jars rested in shade, wrapped with wet cloth to hold a lower temperature. Cups stacked near the edge of the bench, with a separate bowl for rinsing. Water ran from a small spout into a clay jug, making a soft pour. Wine was thinned before serving, as was common in Greece. A strip of linen wiped the lip of the jar clean. The server counted out cups with a slow rhythm. People stepped away, and the bench remained clear of clutter. Tool sellers brought items for daily need. There were spare sandals, cord, and simple needles. Potters displayed small cups and shallow dishes. A repair box sat open for cracked handles and loose lids. Resin warmed in a small pan, giving a faint pine smell. A wooden clamp pressed a mended piece until it cooled. The stall kept a list of finished items for pickup. The pen laid a thin line on a wax tablet, then paused. Light page rustle mixed with the sound of steps on sand. Bronze workers set their workbenches apart from crowded lanes. A low hearth held charcoal in a shallow basin. A narrow pipe fed air from small bellows with short pulls. The flame kept a steady glow without loud flare. An anvil stake fit into a block at knee height. Tongs, hammers, and files lay in a neat row. A water bowl waited for quenching near the stone edge. When a tool needed heat, the worker placed it gently on the coals. The fire gave a soft hiss when a spark fell. Much work focused on strigils, curved metal scrapers for cleaning skin. The shape was a long curve with a firm handle. Athletes carried them with oil flasks in the gymnasium. Edges dulled after repeated use on sand and skin. The smith warmed a strigil and straightened any bend. He filed the edge until it felt even and true. A few light hammer taps set the curve again. Oil rubbed across the metal to guard against rust. The tool returned to the bench with a quiet touch. Knives for cutting food, leather, or cord also needed attention. The blade met a whetstone in long, level strokes. A thin ring of metal dust traced the stone's path. If the edge had a chip, the file helped reshape it slowly. The blade warmed and then cooled in the quench bowl with a quick click. The handle wrap was checked and bound tight if loose. A test on thin leather showed a clean, straight cut. Each step used small force and steady hands. The process stayed measured, without hurry. Leatherworkers repaired straps and sandals near the same row. A simple awl opened holes along a worn edge. Waxed thread slid through in even stitches and lay flat. Buckles were bent back to shape and pinned again. For soft lining, a strip of linen guarded the skin. The bench smelled of oil and new leather in the heat. A weight held the work in place, while a small knife trimmed a corner. The scrap fell without noise onto a pile below. The work kept travelers moving comfortably. Carpenters and rope sellers offered clean fixes for camp gear. A short saw cut pegs from straight-grained wood. A hand plane smoothed a tent pole where the cloth rubbed. Coarse rope was measured from elbow to finger in set spans. Buyers checked the twist and the lay of the strands. A small pot of pitch sealed rope ends against fray. The carpenter used a square to keep angles true. Light shavings drifted down in pale curls. Nothing in the work alarmed or surprised. Supervision kept stalls inside agreed bounds. Officials from Elis marked lines on the ground with chalk. Cooking fires used raised braziers with ashtrays beneath. Water jars stood ready in case a spark fell. Loud trade near the sacred wall was discouraged. Workbenches faced away from the altar paths. Vendors closed before dark, unless given a torch bracket. The rules were posted on a tablet in the council house. They aimed for order, safety, and a clear way through. Payments stayed simple in this early time. Coinage had not yet spread in Greece in the late 8th century. Many exchanges used counted portions of goods agreed in advance. Others used small pieces of metal by weight with a balance. Some buyers kept a tab during the festival and settled at departure. A vendor's tally stick carried notches that matched a wax entry. The focus remained on clear measures and calm steps. The method served temporary crowds without confusion. When heat climbed, awnings cast wide shade over the rows. The cloth billowed slightly with passing wind. At midday, vendors rotated tasks to avoid strain. One person watched the fire. Another handled cups and rinsing. A third wrote short notes and kept the stall swept. The sound of taps, file strokes, and soft voices blended evenly. There was neither sharp call nor hard push. The work moved at a steady rhythm, suited to long days. Evening brought a slow close to the workbenches. Tools returned to pouches and wooden cases. The brazier emptied into an ash pit and cooled. A rope curtain pulled across the stall front and tied at both sides. A final check counted jars, bundles, and mended items. The clerk blew out the lamp with one short breath. Night insects hummed as paths thinned. Light hammer taps faded, and linen awnings rested in still air. The grounds held their quiet shape until dawn returned. Shaded washing areas stood near the gymnasium and practice grounds. Low stone basins lined the wall, with drainage channels packed in clay. Hydriae, three-handled water jars, leaned against posts beside shorter pails. Flat stones formed rims wide enough for setting tools. A rack held folded linen and small sponges. Oil jars rested on a bench away from dust. A brazier warmed a little water for mixing and rinsing. The air smelled of olive oil and wet clay. Water splashed in measured pores and metal rang softly on stone rims. The tools were simple and well arranged. Strigils, curved metal scrapers for cleaning skin, hung from a wood peg. A tray held small knives, tweezers, and narrow probes. Sponges soaked while linen strips dried on a rope. A shallow bowl kept warmed oil beside a wick lamp. Coarse sand sat in a jar for early rubbing when needed. A second bowl held wine vinegar for cleansing. The layout kept wet and dry items apart. Posts carried woven screens to break the sun. Everything could be cleaned quickly and returned to place. Attendance followed a steady order, learned by practice. Each person handled one step and then passed the task along. One attendant confirmed the event just finished and checked for any strain. Another warmed the oil and rubbed joints from light to firm. A third scraped with the strigil, matching the body's lines in short sweeps. A fourth rinsed with water and sponge, keeping the basin clear. The last applied salve if needed and set a simple bandage. The flow stayed smooth, without raised voices or rush. After a contest, the first step reduced dust and sweat. Oil loosened the film that clung to skin after sand and sun. Hands spread thin layers along arms, back, and legs. The touch stayed level and slow, avoiding hard pressure. Joints received circular motions at shoulders, knees, and ankles. Where the skin reddened from friction, the oil formed a light coat. The attendant paused to let it sink a little. The smell of olive oil made a clean, mild note. A cloth kept the bench edge free from drips. The strigil moved next, kept at a safe angle to the skin. Short pulls collected the mix of oil and dust without scraping raw. Each stroke ended with a gentle tap against the basin rim. Metal rang softly, then the tool continued along the next path. The curve fit muscle lines and hollows near the joints. Sand that clung earlier now slid away in thin ribbons. The attendant wiped the blade after each region. Hands checked warmth and relaxed tone before moving on. Breathing slowed as the set rhythm continued. Water followed, poured in small amounts to avoid chill. A sponge traveled from clean areas toward those just scraped. The basin filled only a little before being tipped into the channel. Fresh water replaced it for the next pour. The process avoided muddy pools and kept feet steady. A second attendant held a cloth under the rim to catch splash. The sound of water against stone stayed low and even. Drops dried fast in warm air, leaving skin clear of sand grains. The tools returned to their pegs in order. Minor scrapes received brief, careful attention. A rinse with water came first, then a touch of wine vinegar. If the edge of the skin lifted, a small knife trimmed loose tag ends. The blade met stone earlier for a sharp, clean edge. Honey mixed with a little oil formed a mild salve. The attendant spread a thin layer and set a narrow linen strip. A simple band secured the place without pulling. The goal was clean cover, not tight pressure. Records were not needed. The wound was small and plain. Feet often needed extra care after the track. Attendants brushed soles with soft sand and oil before rinsing. Small splinters from reeds or grass were lifted with tweezers. Heels took a dab of thicker ointment to prevent cracking. Straps from sandals were checked and rubbed with a trace of oil. If a toenail cut into skin, a file eased the edge with slow strokes. Water washed the dust from between toes and dried with a cloth. The basin emptied, and the floor stayed safe and dry. Shoulders and back carried signs of strain after starts and sprints. Attendants placed warm cloths across the shoulder line. Hands pressed along the muscles in steady, measured passes. The neck received short, careful strokes away from the spine. No part was forced or bent sharply. Where a knot held, the pressure paused and lessened. A little oil helped the hands glide without friction. The body warmed under the cloth, then cooled under shade. Breathing stayed even, and the space remained quiet. Care also guarded against sun and heat fatigue. A shaded seat rested near the basins for short pauses. Water was offered in small sips rather than large gulps. A damp cloth cooled the forehead and wrists. If a person felt unsteady, attendants had them sit with feet raised slightly. Salted figs or olives replaced some salt lost to sweat. The steps were basic and calm, suited to warm afternoons. The goal was steady recovery rather than speed. The area returned to work without fuss. The washing spaces were part of a daily schedule. Morning practice produced light use, with short lines and quick cycles. Midday breaks brought a slower pace and more shade screens. After contests, the place filled, and extra basins were set out. Officials directed the queue to keep paths clear. A posted board described simple rules about order and cleanliness. No cooking fires were allowed nearby, and wastewater used set channels. The plan kept dust low and water moving, without puddles or crowding. Supplies were tracked with plain counts. Oil jars entered with sealed stoppers and left with clean dregs. Sponges were washed in a separate basin and hung to dry. Linen strips were cut to size and stacked by width. Vinegar and honey supplies sat on a shaded shelf. Strigils were wiped, oiled, and checked for burrs. If a tool bent or dulled, runners took it to the workbench row. The cycle repeated each day, and little went to waste. The system relied on simple checks, not complex lists. When the sun lowered, the basins were scrubbed and turned. The stone rims dried in the last light under open air. Screens rolled and tied against the posts. Amphorae shifted back to storage with wooden lids. Tools returned to chests wrapped in soft cloth. The brazier emptied into an ash pit and cooled without smoke. A faint scent of oil lingered on the bench. Water from the final rinse traveled down the channel toward fields. Insects began their steady hum beyond the wall. Not every visitor needed the full sequence. Some only asked for oil and a quick scrape. Others rested longer with warm cloths on the legs. The attendants adjusted the order but kept the same care. Each step used small force, clear lines, and clean surfaces. No step depended on special devices. All relied on practiced hands. The space welcomed people from many cities during the festival. The routine made differences small and time predictable. The soundscape stayed gentle and even. Across the day, the same few gestures repeated. Oil spread with palms in long arcs. The strigil curved and rang softly at the basin rim. Water slid from sponge to skin, then to stone and channel. Linen folded into strips and laid down with smooth edges. A spoon tapped a jar for a measured salve. A bowl poured and then rested empty on its side. These motions created a quiet pattern for tired bodies. The place felt useful, simple, and well kept. The river remained near, beyond the grove and the track. Its hush lined the edges of the washing space. A breeze carried the scent of wet stone and clean oil. Footsteps on sand came and went, never sharp or hurried. Attendants finished their lists and set the last tools aside. Water made one more clean splash into the basin. Metal touched stone with a final soft ring. Shade deepened, and the day's care closed in calm order. The sanctuary prepared for the next cycle of effort and rest. The first viewing places at Olympia were simple and practical. Builders used the natural hills around the track and shaped them with tools. The result was an embankment, a raised earth slope, with wide packed terraces. Each terrace held standing groups or low stools brought from camp. Surfaces stayed firm through tamping with wooden rammers and light watering. Markers showed the safe edge near the track. Families and elders watched from these places with calm attention. Reed fans clicked faintly as sun cloths stirred in a dry breeze. Paths led from tents and stoas to the track edges. Officials kept these routes clear with posts and rope lines. People moved along in files and stayed to the marked side. Dust rose in soft sheets where sandals brushed the ground. A few wells and jars stood at turns for slow drinks. The same routes returned to camps and shrines between events. A wooden staff tapped stone where the path met a gate. The rhythm stayed even, and the movement stayed ordered. The embankments were built with layered soil and small stones. Workers spread earth in thin lifts and pressed each layer flat. Brushwood kept the edge from slipping where slopes were steep. Simple drains ran along the terrace backs to carry rare rain. In summer, the ground dried to a hard crust by afternoon. Track officials checked the edges each morning and after races. They filled shallow holes and brushed loose grit aside. The goal was safe footing and a clear line of sight. The track length fixed how far the slopes extended. The stadium measured about 190 meters, about 210 yards. Gentle curves at the ends kept sight lines open for more people. Visitors formed loose bands by town or household, then settled by habit. Elders often chose higher terraces with softer breeze and shade. Younger spectators clustered near the rail where the view was close. Children stayed back from the edge under steady reminders. The pattern became clear without need for signs. Sun cloths, simple sheets on poles, stood at the terrace tops. They were set behind main sight lines to keep the view open. Cords tied to pegs held the cloths against sudden gusts. Light passed through the weave and softened the heat below. Oil flasks and small bread baskets rested on folded mats. The shade shifted by degree during the day's slow turn. People moved a little, then settled again without noise. The cloths breathed with the air and made a muted flap. Order relied on clear rolls as much as on built ground. Stewards walked the lines and kept the edge back from the track. Judges watched from a modest bema, a raised platform, near the finish. Heralds stood close, ready to signal when space was needed. Staff tips touched earth with a quiet tap to guide feet. The same pattern worked race after race. Crowds learned the routine and kept to it with patience. The system favored steady calm over sharp command. Visual marks helped people hold their places. Low stones lined the lanes nearest the running surface. A shallow ditch showed where the embankment ended and path began. Wooden stakes carried simple signs for routes to shrines and wells. Lime streaks, renewed as needed, kept crossing points obvious. At busy turns, a rope swung across until a lane opened. When the line passed, the rope lifted again without delay. Even at peak hours, the parts moved without pressure. The sound across the embankment stayed low and even. Cicadas held a thin thread of noise in the warm trees. Cloth awnings rustled above the terraces and eased the heat. The reed fans clicked in slow hands during long pauses. Low voices merged, but none rose above the rules of the place. From the track came short calls, then the steady pat of feet. After a finish, the murmur swelled and fell again. The air stayed dry, and the dust settled in light sheets. Vendors kept near the edges, without crowding the view. They offered figs, olives, and cool water from glazed jars. Bronze workers at small benches checked strigils and knife pins. Their taps were light and regular under linen awnings. Customers came during pauses and returned before the next event. A scale pan clicked against its mate for simple counts. The zone stayed narrow, so paths remained clear. Work and watching balanced each other without strain. The slopes served many needs beyond viewing. They acted as meeting places for kin and messengers from towns. Runners stretched near the lower edges under watchful eyes. Priests and attendants crossed gently with baskets for the altar. When a herald called, a path cleared in an orderly line. The route to the sacred ash altar opened without delay. After the rite, the terrace fringe filled again in quiet sequence. The same ground supported both sport and ceremony. Weather shaped the routine but did not break it. On still days, heat gathered low and people spread further apart. On days with a breeze, cloths stirred and shadows crept longer. The embankments once packed held their form for many days. After a rare shower, stewards scored channels to drain the surface. They tamped the top again and swept loose sand aside. By morning, the footing felt firm and level to the step. The slopes returned to service with little change. The crowd mixed travelers and nearby households in gentle order. Some had walked for days along the truce roads. Others lived within easy distance and came each summer. People brought small stools, spare sandals, and stoppered oil jars. Elders settled with care, and younger kin brought water. Visitors learned local turns of path and shade by watching. The flow copied the land, not the other way around. The scene repeated across years with small, useful changes. Between contests, a few moved to the river for air. The Alpheus ran broad and quiet beyond the trees. Reed beds aligned with the flow and hid small birds. A light breeze cooled faces and carried the smell of water. Those who rested returned to the terraces by the marked routes. Officials watched the clock of sun and kept the schedule tight. The next race drew people back to their usual places. Footprints layered the paths, but never blocked them. At day's end, light faded across the higher slopes first. People folded cloths, tied cords, and lifted small stools. Stewards checked for forgotten jars and cleared rope lines. The embankments held the warmth of the sun a little longer. Dust settled, and the track grew pale in evening shade. The camp zones took the flow of feet once more. Cooking fires kindled far from the sacred grove. The terraces slept in quiet, waiting for the next day's order. The viewing ground worked because it was simple and well kept. Earth, stone, rope, and cloth set the frame for calm gathering. Clear rolls maintained paths, edges, and time between events. Families and elders stayed within sight and shade without crowding. Reed fans clicked faintly, while suncloths stirred above patient lines. The slopes, shaped by hand and rule, made space for shared attention. Here, watching became part of the games. The land and the people moved together in steady rhythm. The Hellenodikai, local judges from Elis, formed the core of control. They knew the grounds, the paths, and the rule lines well. Each carried a smooth rod to signal moves and mark space. Their robes were plain, and their sandals fit for long standing. They checked lists and spoke in measured tones. The Altes, the sacred grove, stayed calm under their care. A staff tip tapped rhythmically along compacted soil. The sound joined light wind in the pines. The work aimed at fairness and steady timekeeping. Selection drew from households in Elis, the nearby region. A fixed number served for a set festival cycle. They learned rules and routes during months before the contests. Elders taught procedures, and younger men learned by direct tasks. Scholars suggest they used model days to practice order. The training covered starts, finishes, penalties, and safe paths. Robes and rods identified them to visitors and athletes. A cord at the waist held a small wax tablet. A reed case slid shut with a dry click. At dawn, judges walked the grounds in a simple loop. They inspected the track edges, terraces, and marked crossings. Sand was raked smooth where feet had cut uneven steps. The stone starting sill, the balbis, received close attention. Grooves were brushed clean so toes could seat well. A thin cord was tested for a fair release at start. Loose rope lines were tightened along the crowd side. The staff tip tapped earth, then paused at each turn. Oil jars and water stood ready near their post. In the council house, judges checked names before events. Earlier, athletes had sworn to follow fair rules and starts. The Hellenodikai supervised this step with a calm face. Ages, cities, and events were confirmed and noted again. A scribe pressed a stylus into wax to fix details. The reed case closed when a name matched the roll. Any doubt moved to a side list for later review. The goal was a clean field and a clear schedule. The room smelled of oil and cool stone. Schedules guided motion through the entire day's contests. Judges divided runners into heats where numbers were high. Waiting groups stood in shade near a marked lane. Stewards carried the list from the council house to track. A herald announced the next heat with a firm voice. Judges confirmed names at the marshalling point and nodded. A staff tip tapped 3 times to gather the line. Sand shifted under feet as groups moved into place. The track cleared, and the slope crowd settled. At the start, judges watched foot placement on the balbis. Grooves held toes at a single edge, fair for all. The starter raised a hand for silence at the front. A simple cord lay before the runners for a shared cue. The call was short and clear, without flourish or strain. When released, the cord lifted straight and clean. If a runner moved early, a judge raised the rod. The start reset, and the line returned to quiet order. No harsh words were needed, only repeated routine. During a race, judges shifted to the finish side. They stood near a modest platform to see the lane clearly. The first across took the laurel of that heat. Judges watched shoulders and feet with long practice and calm eyes. They signaled the place with a short motion of the rod. If a finish looked close, they gathered and agreed quickly. Times were not recorded, only order and winner's name. A small mark on wax set the result in place. The crowd murmur rose, then faded again. Crowd order remained part of their steady task. Rope lines held walkways open for stewards and attendants. Judges paced crossings where shrines and track paths met. Vendors stayed to the edges under simple known limits. Suncloth sat behind sight lines to keep views clear. A staff tip touched earth to suggest a small step back. People shifted a little and returned to still watching. The altis kept its shape through tools, lines, and habit. The tone stayed low, the movement unforced. Penalties were simple and known to all present. A false start could bring a restart or a fine. Blocking another lane drew a warning or removal from that heat. Judges used rods as signs, not as heavy tools. Fines, when needed, were written on wax and later settled. Scholars suggest some cases moved to a separate bench. There, elders reviewed facts in steady order and tone. The point was clear rules, not sharp example or display. Calm records carried the lesson forward. Between heats, judges checked the balbus again for grit. They smoothed sand by handboard and light rake. A steward lifted the cord and tested its motion once. The staff tip tapped twice to call the next group near. A water jar passed along the shaded marshalling line. Olive oil scent drifted from flasks in the gymnasium nearby. The sun climbed, and shadows moved across packed earth. The routine held without strain or sudden change. Every step followed a recorded plan. The herald and judges worked as a single unit. The herald prepared names and cities for public notice. Judges handed the wax tablet with clear marks and spacing. A bronze trumpet gave one brief note for silence. The herald read, "Winner, city, and event" in plain words. Judges stood aside and watched paths remain open. A wreath from the sacred olive would follow later. The tablet returned to its case with a quiet slide. Another heat prepared at the ball beast with calm care. Records fed into lists used beyond the festival days. The Hellenodikai reviewed winners with a scribe in shade. Names, cities, and events moved from wax to permanent copy. Scholars link these steps to later four-year cycles, the Olympiads. Early forms were simple, but the habit took hold. A board in a stoa showed results for passing readers. The reed case closed when the final line was checked. A staff lay across the bench while figures dried. Paper rustle joined the steady cicada buzz. The judges also watched routes to the sacred altar. When rites were due, they opened a marked lane. Stewards guided baskets and measured fuel to the center. The crowd leaned back, and the rope lines stayed firm. Ash settled slowly as the embers cracked and cooled. When smoke thinned, the lane returned to common use. The staff tip tapped once to confirm a clear path. Sport and ritual shared the ground without conflict. The schedule held both in quiet balance. Their tools were simple and well suited to the work. Rods signaled space. Cords showed even starts. Ropes held paths. Wax tablets kept names safe until final copying. Seals pressed on small tags guarded official roles. Measuring cords, knotted at intervals, checked track distance. A short brush cleared grooves for clean footing. A bench, a jar, and a reed case finished the set. Nothing felt strange to hand or eye. Everything supported calm order and clear sight. As the sun lowered, judges walked one last circuit. They checked lines, stacked markers, and eased a tight rope. A steward noted repairs for early morning hands. The wax tablets returned to their chest in the council house. A lamp flame bent, then steadied in the still room. The staff tip tapped rhythmically along compacted soil. The sound faded near the grove, where pines held cool shade. The day's record lay complete, and the ground stood ready. The next morning would follow the same measured path. In the 8th century BCE, memory at Olympia took material form. Names were cut into stone bases and written on wooden plaques. These records stood within the altes, alongside paths and sacred spaces. The goal was simple: mark donors and victors so events remained clear. Letters were brief and firm, suited to quick viewing in sun. A chisel nipped the surface. Dust fell in a thin line. The work favored order, not flourish. Each sign followed a measured plan, line by line. Stone bases came from local limestone and, later, some marble. Workers smoothed faces with abrasive sand and simple rubbing stones. Edges were squared, so lines would read clean from a distance. Wooden plaques, often of pine or fir, hung under covered walks. Nails or wooden pegs fixed them to beams or posts. Oil sealed the grain against air and insects. The altes offered many spots for such records. Light crossed packed earth and touched pale stone. The same ground hosted races, offerings, and lists. Roles were clear in this quiet craft of memory. A scribe drafted text on wax for checking by officials. The Hellenodikai supplied names, cities, and events in sequence. A lapidary, a worker who cuts and polishes stone, shaped blocks. A letter cutter followed, trained in even spacing and depth. The team worked near a portico for shade and tools. Mallets, chisels, and measuring cords lay on a low bench. A brush and water jar waited to clear grit from grooves. Footsteps clicked softly on worn paving. Layout began before the first stroke reached stone. The scribe set letter height with a marked string. A charcoal line ran straight across the face as a guide. Margins were measured from both sides to keep the field centered. Spacing allowed air between words for simple reading. The draft on wax matched the stone in scale and order. When a correction arose, the wax changed and returned. A reed case slid shut, and the draft sat at hand. Sun warmed the limestone before cutting began. Cutting demanded steady hands and shallow, even grooves. The letter cutter held the chisel at a set angle. Each blow was firm, not heavy, to avoid deep chips. The mallet rhythm stayed slow and regular through the morning. Chips fell in thin curls and gathered along the base. A damp cloth lifted dust without staining the surface. If a stroke slipped, plaster filled the fault in a line. The groove met its neighbor and formed a stable letter. The word emerged without rush or strain. Wooden plaques required another method, but a similar order. A plane smoothed the board. A fine scrape removed raised grain. Gesso, a chalk and glue coating, prepared a paler writing field. A scribe drew guidelines with a light charcoal touch. Letters in carbon black followed, then dried in routine time. Holes at the top edge took twine or pegs for hanging. Resins in the wood gave a slow, clean scent in shade. A cloth wiped the margin. A corner mark confirmed alignment. The plaque joined others beneath a stoa. The content stayed compact and formulaic, suited to clear recall. Victor inscriptions named the athlete, the father, the city, and event. Donor texts stated who set the offering and for what reason. Some added a brief blessing or a mention of the festival. In early forms, letters looked straight and angular on stone. Regional shapes varied, scholars note, across the late 8th century. All aimed at legibility in daylight across a few paces. The tone remained factual and restrained. Memory favored concise, reliable lines. Placement shaped how visitors met these records on the grounds. Bases stood near statues, treasuries, or along processional ways. Wooden plaques appeared under shelter, safe from steady weather. Officials avoided blocking routes or sacred views. Rope markers held a small border around important bases. Readers could pause without crowding paths or shrines. Sun struck the lettering, then slid away under afternoon shade. Dust collected lightly and was brushed in quiet cycles. The site functioned as a calm, open archive. Upkeep kept letters legible through seasons and festivals. Workers brushed stone faces and rinsed grooves with clear water. Some letters received a wash of red or black to sharpen red. Painted plaques were checked for flake or faded lines. When boards wore thin, copies replaced them without ceremony. Old copies likely moved to storerooms near treasuries. A slate list in a portico matched new placements to records. The system spoke softly. Keep what is needed, visible and clean. Memory rested on small, repeated tasks. Visitors engaged these objects in simple, steady ways. Literate travelers read names and cities without hurry. Others asked a companion or listened to a herald's earlier call. The inscription confirmed what the voice had announced publicly. Children traced letters with eyes, while elders spoke dates softly. Straps creaked as people shifted under low awnings. A reed fan clicked faintly while dust rose and settled. The reading took moments, then ended with a quiet step aside. The path remained open and the record stayed fixed. Some inscriptions became anchors for larger timelines later on. Writers from Elis tied years to recurring games, the Olympiads. A victor list at Olympia supported this habit of counting. Scholars suggest early stone and wood records fed those lists. The method was simple: name, city, event, and sequence. Over decades, short lines formed a durable stare of time. The surface stayed factual, without argument or praise. A stylus pressed into wax before transfer to stone. The reed case closed when the last letter matched. Letter forms shifted slowly with period and place. Early letters looked tall and spare, cut with broad angles. Later, curves entered lines where tools allowed safe control. Spacing changed as cutters learned what read best at distance. Some bases showed room left for future names or notes. A faint border framed the field and kept edges clean. The letter cutter adjusted force when meeting softer stone. The mallet met the chisel with a modest tap. Dust fell in a thin line and gathered in a neat pile. Not every record stood in stone near the track. Some names rested on bronze strips or small lead tags. Others appeared on pottery dedicated in the sanctuary. The purpose remained the same across these materials. A person or city fixed a moment to remain visible later. Officials checked spellings against the wax draft each time. A seal on a tablet confirmed completion for the day. The bench held tools in order, ready for the next piece. The routine rarely changed, even when crowds swelled. The workshop near the stoa kept a simple kit. There were chisels of several widths, each for certain curves. A mallet head of hardwood gave a predictable, even strike. Straight edges, chords, and plumb lines checked level and alignment. Small wedges steadied the base while edges were squared. A brush removed grit so letters stayed crisp, not ragged. A water jar cooled both dust and warm metal. A cloth wrapped tools after use to guard edges. Shadows lengthened, and the bench fell quiet again. Officials managed approvals in short, repeated steps. A name came from the judge's wax tablet after a contest. The scribe prepared the line and confirmed with a second reader. The cutter received the text and space design in order. When finished, a steward compared the cut line to the draft. If correct, a discrete mark on the back recorded acceptance. The base moved by rollers or levers to its assigned spot. Ropes tightened. A peg fixed the angle against a wall. A light tap confirmed the wedge held firm. The sanctuary made time for inscriptions within the larger schedule. Early morning favored cutting before heat and glare. Midday allowed drying of painted or washed letters in shade. Late afternoon brought placement, brushing, and final reads. Work slowed during rites and resumed on clear paths again. Vendors kept a respectful gap from active cutting faces. Hammer taps remained light so nearby rites stayed undisturbed. The grove carried pine resin and cool dust scents together. Calm rhythms joined making, reading, and keeping. A few pieces commemorated more than victory or donation. Cities might record repairs or gifts to a building or path. A short line said who funded the work and why it mattered. These notices helped later workers trace duties and care. The same tools shaped these texts on stone or board. The message stayed concise to suit busy walkways. People paused, read, and moved on without pressure. A chisel nipped the surface. Dust fell in a thin line. The ground received what the hand had set. Even when storms visited the Alpheus Valley, memory endured. Stone resisted weather far longer than cloth and rope. Plaques under roofs escaped wet seasons and bright glare. When damage came, copies took their place without fuss. The record lived through the practice of making and replacing. This habit, more than a single famed monument, preserved events. Sound remained modest. Brush whisper, light tap, soft footstep. The eye carried the rest, line by line. The sanctuary's order extended into the everyday craft of writing. As evening neared, tools returned to their chest one by one. The scribe covered the wax tablet to keep dust away. A steward lifted a plaque and checked its stable hanger. The cutter wiped stone dust from hands with a damp cloth. The bench stood bare except for a folded cloth and cord. Far off, the river hush met low cicada buzz again. A faint glow lingered on pale letters under the stoa. The names waited in still air for the next calm reading. The grove settled back into quiet shade. Departure from Olympia followed calm order at the festival's end. Stalls closed, cords loosened, and awnings folded under careful hands. Officials checked last postings and tied bundles of wax tablets. The river air cooled the evening and eased warm dust. Cart shafts slid into harness rings, and mule bells gave soft notes. Families lifted oil jars, bedding rolls, and bread baskets in turns. Embers in cooking pits dimmed and were covered with sand. The sanctuary grew wide with space again. The Alpheos hush carried between trees and paths. Roads from the Altes led first toward Elis and nearby towns. Travel truce rules eased but still shaped safe, slow departure. Groups kept to marked tracks and yielded at narrow bends. Leather straps creaked as loads settled with the first mile. Sandals scuffed on compacted soil, steady and unhurried. Wells near the gates offered the last cool refill for skins. Guides pointed to fords made familiar on the way in. A reed fan clicked as someone checked the breeze direction. Light faded from stone faces and pale plaques. Travelers joined the same approach routes in reverse sequence. Paths crossed shallow fords of the Alpheos and smaller streams. Simple bridges of timber and stone took carts at walking pace. Way stations offered shade, fodder, and a place to mend straps. Distances matched a day's walk, about 20 to 30 kilometers. Marked trees and small piles of stones showed reliable turns. Mule drivers used low calls to keep pairs aligned on grade. Dust lifted in thin layers and drifted back to the verge. The road held a quiet line across the plain. Some groups turned coastward toward modest harbors and ferries. Crews stacked cargo and rolled jars into wicker cradles. Oars dipped with a soft splash near the mouth of the river. Sailcloth stirred against masts as evening air grew steady. Boats moved north toward the Corinthian Gulf or south along Elis. Shipmen repeated the festival dates as they priced passage. Passengers sat against bundles and listened for town names. Rope fibers creaked and then settled under even pull. Lantern light marked each deck hatch at mooring. News traveled with the first steps and strokes away from Olympia. Travelers reported winners, home cities, and the stadion length again. Herald words, inscription readings, and wax notes supported memory. A scribe from a town council leaned over a small tablet. A stylus scratched softly while names received a line. The list would guide a local calendar and later offerings. In markets along the road, vendors repeated the victor's city. Tin cups clinked. A baker wrapped warm barley loaves in cloth. The message stayed short and precise to avoid confusion. The habit of counting by Olympiads grew as lists spread. An Olympiad, a 4-year period marked by a victor's year, fixed time. Writers from Elis used this cycle to order events for records. Town officials could match their own months to that point. Festivals and contracts found a common anchor across regions. Scholars suggest this practice stabilized in steps, not all at once. Farmers, traders, and teachers learned the phrase over seasons. A reed case slid shut when the count was copied cleanly. The cycle advanced in quiet, regular turns. Return days also brought local duties for some travelers. A victor's family prepared simple offerings at a home altar. City staff planned a small notice for a hall or stoa. Bronze workers checked a strigil or lamp for needed repair. A shoemaker replaced worn thongs before the next long walk. None of this required loud display or public parade. It was routine work that linked festival and town. Smoke from a household hearth rose in a straight line. Olive branches clicked together where a breeze found them. Calm habits resumed around known thresholds. Merchants and artisans carried the news into wider circuits. Potters on mule trains traded vessels and short reports together. Bronze workers moved toward workshops with orders from camps. A leather worker repeated dates while measuring a strap for a pack frame. A small jar of festival ash, taken with care, returned to a shrine. At each stop, the same names and events were spoken plainly. Coins rang against a scale pan in a shaded stall. Oiled axles turned and settled under new loads. The route knitted many towns with measured threads of information. Way stations recorded travel and messages in modest formats. A caretaker kept a chalk line list on a wooden board. He marked groups departing east, south, or north by road. The board cleared at season's end and began again next year. A well bucket thudded lightly against the curb, then rose. Mule hooves scuffed, and harness rings clicked during watering. On a pillar, someone scratched a brief note about distance. The sun moved past noon. Shadows slipped into the shelter. Routine sounds kept the place calm and useful. Administrative offices in towns turned news into stored memory. A clerk in a council house updated a year list on wax. Another transcribed to a long roll for safer keeping later. The roll joined others tied with linen in a wooden chest. A seal pressed warm wax on the cord, leaving a mark. In a stoa, a smaller board showed the victor for passers-by. Children traced straight letters with a fingertip and moved on. Brushes swept dust from benches in quiet arcs. The space returned to normal traffic and light talk. Islands and distant coasts received the news by ship. Traders carried the victor's name to ports in the Aegean. Shipmasters heard it again while seeking water and fresh bread. Letters on thin tablets crossed to another city archive. A teacher in a small school recited the cycle during lessons. A lamp wick hissed faintly. Pages dried near an open door. Over time, chronographers filed these points into longer tables. Dates from many regions could meet at one shared reference. The Olympiad count linked far shores in steady fashion. Evening on the road felt composed and regular after departure. Camps formed near wells or in old olive groves. Fires stayed small and watched, with cooking stones in a ring. Off to one side, a driver checked a loose wheel pin. Wagon wheels creaked, then settled as the load balanced. Cloaks served as covers. Sandals lay beside rolled mats. Someone repeated the winter's city and the festival month. The words were plain, free of flourish or debate. Stars appeared while the river air cooled the evening. Early the next day, travelers rose and took quiet inventory. Oil flasks were capped, waterskins filled, and knots checked. Carts moved before the sun warmed the plain. Simple markers showed a fork toward Corinth or Arcadia. The ground produced the same steady sounds as before. Where a bridge narrowed, groups paused and made room. The habit of yielding kept the pace even for all. Pack animals nodded under light taps of the lead rope. Dust rose briefly, then drifted back to the roadside grass. A few parties paused at local sanctuaries on their route. They placed small tokens and spoke the date of the recent games. An attendant noted the offering and added a short entry. Wax took the mark, and the tablet returned to its case. The altar stones held a faint, clean scent of yesterday's ash. A reed broom brushed stray leaves from the step. Bells from grazing animals sounded in a distant rhythm. Paths from many farms met the road nearby. Life and record met in quiet, shared places. Some towns planned small contests tied to the Olympia schedule. Local officials synchronized their own events to the 4-year pulse. Notices went up on wooden boards near market porticos. Painters refreshed letters with black wash for clear reading. Visitors understood the cycle without needing a long speech. The Olympiad count gave each town a way to align dates. Courtyards filled with low voices as people planned travel. A clerk checked a line again before closing the office. The door latch clicked. Street sounds returned to normal. Winter copying kept the memory available between festivals. Scribes recopied victor lists from wax to new parchment. Pages dried in cool air, flat under smoothed wooden boards. The roll grew in small sections, tied with a simple cord. Storage shelves took the weight of another year's record. The work remained slow, careful, and without large gesture. In the margin, a cautious hand noted the host city. The next clerk would recognize the structure at a glance. Many hands kept one system quietly alive. Years later, the same departure pattern repeated without strain. The sanctuary filled, emptied, and handed out news again. Lists gained another line and moved outward by road and sea. Towns updated calendars and small plaques in shaded places. Teachers taught the count to a fresh group of pupils. The stadium sand kept its marks, then smoothed in the wind. The Alpheus carried the same low hush away to the west. Wagon wheels creaked while river air cooled the evening. Memory traveled safely along familiar paths. The sanctuary stood quiet and clear. The grove held steady shade, and the track kept its long, level lane. A thin breeze moved across olive leaves and dry grass. The Alpheus River gave a low, even hush beyond the trees. Reed fans clicked once or twice, then rested on laps and knees. The sprint remained the plain center of the meeting. It used one straight course on firm, wet sand. Officials packed the lane with wooden rammers and a little water. They checked edges marked with posts and short rope lines. A starting sill of hard stone carried parallel grooves for toes. These grooves guided the stance and kept the line straight. People called the race a stade, a sprint of about 180 meters, or about 200 yards. The length matched the space between the stone sill and a set finish line. Guides measured the course with knotted cords and confirmed the marks. They brushed the surface with flat reeds and scraped ridges away. A water jar tipped a slow pour, and the sand held together. The judges from Elis, the Hellenodikai, local judges from the city of Elis, watched each step. One judge stood near the start with a rod, and another held the lane clear. A third kept the list and checked each name and city. They used set rules for lane space, start timing, and finish order. Hands stayed steady, and voices stayed low. The starter raised a thin signal. Feet set into the grooves without shoes. Bodies leaned forward over the line. The signal fell, and the lane took even, quick steps. Sand held prints that faded with the next impact. The slope stayed measured in its sound. It was a short race, and it ended soon. The Finnish judge marked first across the line with a simple sign. He looked once at the lane, then nodded to the list keeper. The winning prints were clear near the edge. The course showed one clean track where speed had pressed hardest. No crowd rush followed. Only a calm murmur and soft reed clicks came back. The award remained small and exact. A wreath from a wild olive near the temple gave the sign of victory. A helper cut slim branches with a bronze blade and formed a circle. The leaves felt cool and dry. The smell was plain and green. The wreath sat light on hair and skin, and the shape kept its place. The list kept memory beyond the day. A scribe used a stylus, a pointed writing tool, on wax boards framed in wood. He pressed the name, the father's name, and the city. He left small spaces between each line for later checks. When the wax cooled, he closed the board on its hinge. He then tied a cord around it to keep the leaves of the board flat. Some names moved from wax to wood or stone. A worker copied the line with black ink on a flat board for daily reading. Later, a cutter could set the most important names onto stone. The stone stood longer than wood or wax. Through this, the race left more than footprints on sand. Simple tools made each part steady. Rammers, cords, rods, rakes, and water jars filled one corner of the field. A low bench held the wax boards and a small oil lamp. A clay jar guarded extra styluses. Beside them, short posts and rope sets leaned in a neat bundle. Nothing looked rich, but each tool matched a clear task. The sanctuary watched quiet order. Paths from tents and stoas met near the grove. Food smoke thinned. A last loaf warmed on a stone. A pot gave off a faint note of fennel and barley. Sandals beat soft patterns on the ground and then stopped. A boy folded a suncloth with slow hands and tied it with a cord. The river's steady sound gave a base for everything. It did not rush. It held one long note. Small leaves rubbed together above the track edges. From a distant stall, one or two hammer taps came as a maker fixed a pin. They were spaced and light. The taps did not break the air. They only counted slow moments. The sprint explained the meeting in plain steps. A line, a start, a run, a finish. The wreath made the act visible and simple. The list shaped what would be kept. These three parts worked together in the same space. They needed little wood, little bronze, and trained eyes. They needed order more than weight. Rules kept the order clear. The judges checked the start, the course, and the end. They corrected a foot across the line or a hand too soon. A packed stick pressed the sand to remake the place. The line returned to plain shape. The next runner stood, and the work continued with no rush. The grove's light fell lower. Shadows grew long but stayed soft at the edges. Dust hung close to the ground and then settled. A strigil scraped oil from an athlete's arm near a wash basin. The sound was a clean metal whisper. A small splash followed as water rinsed sand from ankles and feet. The record table stayed the last busy point. A judge checked one board and called a name quietly for the scribe to hear. The scribe nodded and pressed the stylus with care. The board took a full line and then another. When the final space closed, the stylus lay on the rim. The lamp wick was pinched. A thin thread of smoke rose and faded. Away from the track, travel gear was packed in steady order. A rope wrapped around folded wool. A cup slid into a bag beside a comb and a pin. The smell of oil and leather was mild and dry. Two poles lifted a small awning, then leaned together for travel. Pegs clicked into a wooden box. Light tool work continued at one edge of the sanctuary. A tent stake seated deeper with a soft hammer touch. A barrel hoop met small taps and closed tight. A hinge pin took a single firm stroke and sat straight. These were short notes against the river's long note. They balanced the space rather than filled it. The track crew made the lane ready for quiet. They brushed out footprints in one long pass. The rake teeth made thin lines that held for a moment and then blurred. A jar tilted a last pour along the sill. The stone sill shone a little where water passed, then returned to a dull tone. The grooves looked even and clean. Olive leaves shifted once more. A slight breeze crossed the grove and touched hair and cloth. It left no mark, only a cooler feel on skin. Dust at ankle height moved and fell. The smell of warm earth was plain and dry. The day's heat eased in small stages. Near the riverbank, the ground grew damp and compact. Reeds knocked lightly together in an even beat. A herdsman guided animals to a lower path with a hushed call. Hooves made round prints that filled with a little water. The prints held shape and then lost it at the edges. All of it stayed quiet. The sanctuary's stone faces took on even shade. Steps on the main path slowed and became rare. The sound of cloth being folded moved across the space and ended. A leather strap tightened on a pack and clicked. A drinking cup met another cup once and made a dull ring. The ring did not carry far. Beside the track, the wreath-maker gathered thin twigs and loose leaves. He set them in a basket and covered them with cloth. The blades slid into a sheath with a soft scrape. The basket moved to a cool corner under the eave. The air there felt still and held a faint green scent. On the record bench, the wax boards rested in a stack. A cord crossed them in two directions and tied flat. The knot sat on the top board, small and square. The stylus lay across the knot. The board edges were smooth with many hands. Their work would survive travel and remain legible on arrival. At the grove's edge, two poles stood against a tree. Rope loops hung from one pole, neat and even. A folded suncloth rested on top, its corners aligned. A peg bag hung from a hook and made no sound. The ground under this kit was bare from many days of use. It was firm and free of stones. The river hush continued at a steady level. Leaf rustle added a soft texture near the ear. In the distance, one last hammer tap sounded and then paused. Another came after a short space. A third came later than the second. Each was lighter than the one before. The space between them widened until it felt like only the river remained. The grove held that simple pattern for a long, calm span. Water moved and kept its bass sound. Leaves shifted without strain. A small moth touched a post and left again. The air cooled a little more. A nearby jar settled as clay met stone. Nothing asked for attention. The place kept even breath. The track lay smooth and unused. The grooves at the sill kept their sharp lines. The finish mark stayed clear and thin. The cords were rolled and tied. The rakes leaned together near the bench. The water jar stood upright with its mouth covered by a flat shard. Names on wax stayed still under the tied cord. The wreath lay light in its basket and kept its shape. The rod of the starter leaned against the bench and showed small dents. The judges' seats faced the track and would face it again. Tools, rules, and records waited without hurry. The river hush went on. Leaves gave quiet rubs in small bursts. Far off, one more faint hammer note reached the ear. It was round and short. Then the night sound took the space again. The sanctuary held that calm with no change, and the day ended in order.